The battle that'll define the fate of not just Taiwan's sovereignty but the safety of the entire Indo-Pacific region and the world is unlikely to be won by sheer naval superiority. According to most military experts, the engagement will instead be defined by who of the two main combatants, the United States and China, can claim air superiority over the Taiwan Strait first. It's also the general consensus that the United States' fifth-generation aircraft, the F-35, can handily win this fight, on one condition: the availability of these fighters in the region. In the heat of war, everything can change in a fraction of a second, so it may all rest on whether America's hardy set of F-35s is in striking distance when it all goes down. But here's the thing: combat aircraft can't just perpetually float on their own. If the United States had its F-35s endlessly patrolling the airspace of the Taiwan Strait, they'd not only waste a truly comical amount of fuel, but provoke the exact kind of PRC response that the US and its allies are seeking to avoid. With that silly military fantasy out of the way, we must ask the pivotal question: if America's F-35s can change the tide of a potential conflict with the People's Liberation Army Air Force, where will they be deployed from? Before we get into all the spicy details about the new American tech slated to be sidling up to the Taiwan Strait, we first need to rewind a little bit and explore how things escalated earlier in the year. China's war of words against Taiwanese independence has multiple times come unsettlingly close to turning into irreversible action. We've seen the dissemination of propaganda and misinformation, cyber attacks against important infrastructure, and even Chinese warplanes flying uncomfortably close to the midline of the Taiwan Strait. In late January, early February, the United States and Japan conducted several days of joint naval exercises involving multiple aircraft carriers, a hot-button topic as you've probably put together by now. According to the participating carrier groups, the exercises involved air defense drills, sea surveillance, cross-deck exercises, and tactical maneuvers to, quote, advance unique high-end warfighting capability. Given both China's hostilities and the increasing frequency of North Korean bluster, the U.S. has made interoperability with its Indo-Pacific allies one of its key goals in the immediate future. Needless to say, China isn't the biggest fan of this, and the results of the joint exercises left them feeling even more bitter. Some of the key naval assets in attendance include the Nimitz-class supercarriers, the USS Carl Vinson, flagship of Carrier Strike Group 1, CSG-1, and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, flagship of Carrier Strike Group 9, or CSG-9, along with the Japanese Hyuga-class helicopter carrier, the JS Issei, and 9 other supporting vessels. According to the Carl Vinson Strike Group commander, Rear Admiral Carlos Sardiello, the U.S. and Japan, which have a mutual defense treaty, are, quote, uniquely capable of rapidly assembling multiple large-deck naval forces in support of mutual security interests in the Indo-Pacific. A joint statement from the involved strike forces also read, the CSG-1 and CSG-9 are currently deployed to U.S. 7th Fleet Area of Operations in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Another thing that the Chinese Communist Party was not eager to hear in the slightest. While this is a strong projection of power from Allied forces in the region, it didn't exactly succeed in lowering China's diplomatic temperature. In the last several years, there have been a number of close calls that put China and the U.S. at each other's throats. Chinese forces have often intercepted U.S. or U.S.-aligned crafts, passing through the area that they perceive to be their territory. But these interceptions are often haphazard and dangerous, resulting in tangible danger to both parties. And this isn't a once or twice issue either. According to recently declassified files from the Pentagon, there have been almost 200 of these dangerous near-miss situations, any of which could have led to a massive escalation in military tensions if they'd gone deadly. Between the Theodore Roosevelt and the Carl Vinson, which had both been stationed in the area for the exercises, and the USS Ronald Reagan, which was at dock at its home port of Yokosuka, Japan, the total number of American aircraft carriers in the region was 3. However, it wasn't long, mid-February specifically, that the U.S. was in talks to deploy 2 more aircraft carriers, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George Washington, into the area for a grand total of 5. Why? It had everything to do with the F-35s. Now, let's get back to warplane deployment. Of course, if we're talking land deployment, the U.S. certainly has a number of valuable allies in the region who could play host to a healthy stoke of 5th-gen combat aircraft ready to be taken on by Air Force personnel stationed at the many American military bases in the Indo-Pacific. Japan, Korea, and Singapore all make logical decisions for regional allies that would have a lot to gain from supporting U.S. aerial defense against a PLAAF assault. Japan recently invested $35 billion of their own F-35s, an incredibly worthy investment for a craft that might make the difference between victory and submission. The Philippines is also becoming an increasingly gracious host to the U.S. military, offering additional land-based deployment opportunities that could prove vital when the chips are down. The Philippine and U.S. navies even performed large-scale joint exercises in the South China Sea as an act of both preparation and power projection, much to the chagrin of the PLA. It's clear the Philippine alliance is a vital feather in America's cap. But if we're being honest with ourselves here, land-based deployment would still be a compromise, one that could shave off those vital seconds that make all the difference during modern warfare. For the U.S. to maintain a comprehensive advantage over China during the fight for Taiwan, comprehensive sea deployment is still the premier option. This leads us to the very scenario that this video is all about: 5 U.S. aircraft carriers parked in China's backyard. Simultaneously, the secret to a potential U.S. and allied victory and a dangerous gamble that could play into the start of a conflict in the first place. Because geopolitics is nothing if not terrifyingly complicated. But don't worry, we're here to break it down for you. Due to the fact that naval assets move and land masses don't, and please don't get on our case about tectonic shifts, we're a geopolitics channel, not a geography and geology channel. Sea deployment offers unparalleled flexibility, and this is something that the U.S. and its regional allies are very much aware of. Remember that massive F-35 buy in Japan that we mentioned a minute ago? The Japanese military is already equipping its warships with F-35Bs for quick deployment, but that's nothing compared to the hardware the U.S. is rocking in this regard. While the U.S. Navy's America-class amphibious assault ships can deploy an impressive 20 F-35Bs, that still looks like small potatoes compared to the pride and joy of the U.S. Navy, the aircraft carriers, each one equipped to deploy a whopping 50 F-35Cs at rapid speed. With multiple aircraft carriers in the field, plus the land-deployed crafts from the U.S.'s regional allies, you can see how the tide of any aerial battle would quickly shift in America's favor. Because of elevated tension spurred on by China's increasing military brashness and aggression in both its actions and rhetoric, focused mainly against its favorite embattled neighbor Taiwan, it only made sense to increase the number of aircraft carriers deployed to the immediate vicinity to 5, which, if you don't feel like doing the math yourself, makes for an impressive total of 250 5th-gen aircraft from the carriers alone. An incredibly formidable showing by anyone's standards, referred to in intelligence circles as a wall encircling China when added to the aerial firepower of America's regional allies. This kind of air power projection makes for a radical shift in what's known as the deterrence equation, which thus far has been the most valuable U.S. measure in preventing a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. To put it simply, if the U.S. and its allies can continually make the PLA's cost-benefit analysis for a Taiwan invasion swing way more heavily to the cost than the benefit side, the war can be prevented for another day. And according to the most recent data, China has good reason to believe that the aerial portion of a Taiwan invasion would present costs that far outweigh the potential benefits. Let's take a look at what the PLAAF has to offer when it comes to China's attempts at wresting air supremacy from their American and regional rivals. China is working with a pitifully few J-31 sea-launched 5th-gen aircraft, with a mere 100 land-launched J-20 aircraft to supplement them, up against the comparatively impressive force of American and allied craft. Even sadder, at present, China has literally no sea-launched F-35B or F-35C equivalents, leaving them woefully behind their enemies. But that's no reason for anyone to get complacent. War is a high-stakes game of uncertainty, and the only way to limit the potential risk is to consider all available factors. By law, the United States Navy has 11 aircraft carriers, almost half of which would be dispatched to counter China under this plan. Each one is essentially a floating fortress, manned with up to 5,000 sailors and a matching extreme price tag, with the newest of the U.S. aircraft carriers, the USS Gerald R. Ford, costing around $13 billion. And if China is to be believed, they may have a dangerous weapon that could nullify the combat advantage of sea deployment that the aircraft carriers provide: carrier killers. More professionally known as the DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, these deadly munitions have harbored a reputation for two frightening things. One is being able to reach Guam from China with its estimated range of 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers, and the other is its purported anti-ship capabilities. They are the pride and joy of the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, often shortened to the unfortunate acronym PLARF, which sounds a little like something you might say while falling down the stairs. And in 2022, China increased the number of DF-26s from 300 in 2021 to 500. With an estimated number of 250 launchers to work with, The PLARF could unleash 500 of the supposed carrier killers within one reload, an extremely frightening fact if you're one of the thousands of sailors stationed on one of the U.S. Navy's Nimitz or Ford-class carriers. In 2021, satellite imaging saw mock-ups of U.S. aircraft carriers in the Ruochang area of Xinjiang's Taklamakan Desert in northwest China, which has historically been used for PLARF target practice. It's clear that China really wants the carrier killer to live up to its nickname. Of course, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and the U.S. Navy isn't just sitting on its hands in reaction to the development and stockpile increase of the DF-26. It's instead been developing what the Navy refers to as its layered ship defense system. The first and most important tenet in the plan is the Navy's efforts to ruggedize its carrier force, a multi-pronged initiative designed to reduce the threat of the carrier killers. Carriers are being fitted with MQ-25 Stingray refueling drones, an emerging technology that will allow warplanes dispatched from the carriers to be refueled remotely, increasing their range and reducing their dependency on the carrier that deployed them. But this also benefits the carriers in the face of the Chinese missiles. With increased range, carriers can often afford to remain further away from Chinese shores, while still dispatching F-35s, keeping them at a safer distance from the PLARF launchers. Cutting-edge technology combined with collaborations with Japan has also offered the U.S. another layer of defense against Chinese anti-ship missiles, thanks to a combination of tech known as the Aegis Combat System, which utilizes common computing standards, software, fire control, and highly sensitive radar detection to locate, track, and destroy incoming enemy ballistic missiles. Because U.S. carriers operate in groups known as carrier strike groups, cruisers and destroyers are also able to take advantage of Aegis to improve their protective capabilities, using SM-2, SM-3, and SM-6 interceptor missiles to take out the carrier killers before they can complete their intended purposes. Some of these carriers are also packing rolling airframe missiles, Sea Sparrow missiles, and close-in weapon systems, which can work in conjunction to unleash a huge number of intercepting projectiles that would massively reduce a carrier killer's chance of hitting its target. There are also some more sophisticated anti-missile measures equipped on the carriers like the USS Abraham Lincoln that can stop carrier killers in their tracks without firing any projectiles themselves. There's the Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program Block 3, a technology that's able to locate and identify incoming guided projectiles before jamming their electronic targeting systems, making them unable to complete their objectives. All of this, coupled with networking technologies that interlink sea vessels, helicopters, warplanes, and satellite technology, allows an unprecedented level of coordination and operational awareness. It's a kinda technological safety net that gives the U.S. carriers the best possible chance of identifying and eliminating carrier killers, even when fired en masse by the PLARF. These carriers also are no slouch when it comes to physical ruggedness. They're built with immensely heavy armor, redundancies in their electrical systems in the event of damage, and hundreds of watertight compartments that prevent flooding in the event that the hulls are breached. The crews are even trained to work around damaged facilities in the event of a successful attack on the carriers that cause actual structural damage. The U.S. carrier strike teams also have an advantage over Chinese forces, one that the U.S. is often stated to have a holistic advantage over China: actual combat experience. Even as recently as early 2024, U.S. aircraft carriers like the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower have been repelling real attacks from Houthi militants during conflicts in the Red Sea. According to one of the captains of the Eisenhower Strike Team destroyers, they faced attacks from anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned surface vessels, and now unmanned underwater vessels or UUVs, all loaded with explosives. The PLARF is yet to be put through its paces in a real conflict, and oftentimes genuine combat experience is one of the most determinative factors in combat outcomes, which gives the U.S. aircraft carriers just one more potential edge over their Chinese rivals. If we're all lucky, then the 5 U.S. aircraft carriers being deployed to the Indo-Pacific region will fulfill their intended purpose to keep the PLA aggression in check, bolster the strengths of regional partners, and keep Taiwan safe for another day. And given the increasingly comprehensive defenses on the carriers, they're more formidable than ever. Only time will tell if all of that will be enough to stop war from tearing apart the region and the world. 1960, Tanbing, Laoding, China. 1 in 20 villagers has died of starvation. A report states that several children have been eaten. February 25, 1960, Hongtai Commune, Lao Hejia Village. Yang Zhongchen, a poor farmer, is arrested for a recent crime. The victim is Yang Ershun. The report states relationship with the culprit younger brother, manner of crime, killed and eaten, reason, livelihood issues. That same report includes other victims of cannibalism in that same city. 12 were killed and eaten, 16 died of other causes and were eaten after. 48 bodies were exhumed and eaten. These numbers were of course very small in the great scheme of things relating to a so-called Great Famine, but there's arguably nothing sadder and more shocking than people resorting to eating members of their own family. The desperation felt all over China in those dark days was something most people will never understand, but today we'll try and help you get there. The man who was responsible for this wickedness, or at least the person we find more guilty than any other man, was Mao Zedong. Let's first have a look at how he rose up to become what some people have said is the worst mass murderer in the history of tyrants. Mao came into this world on December 26, 1893 in the small rural community of Shaoshan in the province of Hunan, China. His family were farmers, just as many people were in this area, with Mao himself leaving school to work in the fields at the age of 13. It seems he didn't take to farming as his father had wanted. Instead, he enjoyed books and poetry. He was especially fond of science and philosophy, and even at a young age had his head in the sometimes difficult works of the philosopher and economist Karl Marx. Mao got his wish when at the age of 17 he went off to study, which led to him joining the Revolutionary Army and the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang. In 1911, Mao supported the Qinghai Revolution, the event that put an end to Imperial China and its Qing dynasty. At this point, Mao was still a nobody, and although he qualified to work as a teacher, the jobs never came and he ended up working in a library in Beijing. This was an exciting time for Mao, who was intently watching Russia from a distance when it had its revolution in 1917. Communism was the way forward, Mao thought, inspired by the likes of Marx and the first head of Soviet Russia, Vladimir Lenin. No sooner than the Chinese Communist Party was formed, Mao became a member. China was a country whose peasants had known much suffering and experienced many terrible famines, and Mao believed that had to change. Communism, he reckoned, was the way forward. Power to the people, the simple farming folks, was what the young Mao said in his head each night as he drifted off to sleep. The short version of the story is that the Chinese Nationalist Party fell out with the Communist Party, and with the latter being persecuted by the former, there was an uprising and Mao was at the forefront of it. We apologize for the brevity here, but there's so much we have to explain later. Basically, Mao led the Red Army against the Nationalists, and in 1934 he formed the Soviet Republic of China, putting 10 Chinese provinces under communist control. His bands of peasant guerrillas were hunted down. The Long March happened, which was actually a series of marches of communist armies in retreat from the Kuomintang army. The distance covered was some 8,000 miles, and on the way many people died, perhaps as many as 30,000, but many more endured that perilous journey to the end. And if any name was mentioned in the capacity of heroism, it was Mao's. It was this period in history that would cement his popularity. There were facts and there was mythology, something that many years later helped Mao secure a so-called cult of personality. There was still a split in the country in 1937 when the Japanese invaded, and what happened next further helped Mao construct a mythology about himself. His Red Army fought with the Allied forces against the Japanese invaders, and when the war was over, he was in a strong position to rule over all of China. The nationalist politician, revolutionary, and military leader Chiang Kai-shek made a peace agreement with Mao. But in the end, there wasn't much peace. The communist forces grew in size, aided by weapons sent to them by Joseph Stalin, the most powerful person in the Soviet Union. The fight raged on. The peasants rallied for the communists, millions upon millions of them. Hundreds of thousands died on both sides. But it was the communists that won in the end, helped a lot by the nationalists having their hands full with Japan in the war. When it was done, Mao promised change. He promised to redistribute the land, to make life fairer, and the peasants bought into it. He may have had good intentions, but little did anyone know right then that things would take a turn for the worse. The understatement of the century. Still, Mao did battle against warlords who'd ruled over the countryside with an iron fist. He did manage to reduce the number of opium addicts in the country, and he did create policies that made it more possible for the poor to get a formal education. His policies even improved life expectancy for the poor, but that was about to change drastically. Times were better, though, at this point for many people whose lives had been a living hell. Chairman Mao was indeed a champion of the people, even if that meant the summary executions of landowners, at times burying those folks while they were still breathing. As Mao often alluded, you need to break a lot of eggs to make an omelet, or, in his words, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. All over China, things were changing fast. Mao spoke about the enemies of the rural classes, those wicked landowners that had oppressed them for years. In villages throughout the country, they were executed one by one, with a scholar later saying there was at least one landlord and usually several in virtually every village for public execution. Sometimes their wives were spared but were forced into being concubines for the once persecuted. Mao's omelet was bloody. There's no doubt about that, with some sources saying there were 200,000 to 800,000 executions, and other sources stating it was more like 2 to 5 million. Those are some big differences, but as you'll see today, scholars often vehemently disagree over numbers when it comes to Mao's China. Now you might be thinking, surely a lot of people complained and protested about these violent land reforms, and you'd be right to think that. Mao even created something called the 100 Flowers campaign, which was supposed to let people air their grievances about the party and its policies. Some did just that, and many of them were the folks who Mao distrusted the most, the intellectuals and those Mao believed were rightists. After speaking their minds, these people were often sent straight to prison or sent to work in the labor camps, which was often a ticket to a slow death. Mao did seem to embrace a critique at the start, but that later changed. Hundreds of thousands were persecuted this way. These were sometimes members of his own party, but also regular folks he suspected of holding rightist views. As an example, in Gansu province, two men named Sun Daiankai and Lang Daijun had expressed that Mao's idea for a project to conserve water wouldn't work. They were subsequently called anti-party by Mao and punished. That project went ahead and entailed a hard graft of around 160,000 people. They basically were asked to move mountains and were worked half to death, having to survive by living in caves and foraging for food. This was just one of many Mao's ideas that failed, and failed badly. It's estimated that 2,400 of the workers died from the toil itself. And guess how much clean water came out of it? None. It was a complete failure. Although not something many people wanted to talk about. That was the thing about such harebrained projects. If anyone criticized them, they were denounced as being anti-party. But many people in the party believed that they were really changing the world for the better and making China a country that would be more powerful than the UK and close even to the USA. One of those officials said, "We are supernatural. Maybe on another planet there are people who are brighter than we are, in which case we are of the second order. But if we are brighter than they are, we are the supernaturals of the first order." To be as powerful as Britain, Mao said that China's steel output had to be significantly increased. In 1958, all over China, the people of the villages had their own little steel refineries in their backyards. A nation was hell-bent on massive production. As was always the case with the Communist Party, this was watched over by every commune's boss, aka the cadres. Daily targets had to be met, and those targets were often unrealistic. This was all part of Mao's Great Leap Forward, summed up by one scholar like this. Mao thought that he could catapult the country past its competitors by herding villagers across the country into giant people's communes. In pursuit of a utopian paradise, everything was collectivized. People had their work, homes, land, belongings, and livelihoods taken from them. In collective canteens, food distributed by the spoonful according to merit became a weapon used to force people to follow the party's every dictate. Mao wasn't going around China to every village. Instead, there were lower-ranking party members responsible for making those targets, and they often ruled over communes with exceptional brutality. Those local cadres would often inflate the production figures just to make the party officials happy. But when that happened, and it happened a lot, the leaders started seeing success where there wasn't any. Many of those villagers were worked to death, and there was often the punishment of going without food if they didn't meet their targets, so some slowly starved to death. Others simply had the life beaten out of them. By April 1958, hunger was widespread all over China. In Guangxi, 1 in every 6 people had no food. In Shandong, 670,000 people were on the verge of starving to death. In Anhui, it was 1.3 million. Mao had hoped to make China great again with the Great Leap Forward, but if China was leaping anywhere, it was into the furnace, metaphorically speaking. This was the result of forced labor for steel production, but also various other projects. It meant that these people weren't doing what they usually did, which was growing food. But the cadres also lied about food production. In just one place called Luxi, the local head wrote back to Beijing to say every farmer was producing 300 kilos of grain a year, when the real figure was half that. This was going on everywhere. In another province, the grain production was 82,000 tons in 1957. In 1960, it was 18,000 tons, but the boss told party officials it was 130,000 tons. The outcome of this so-called target fever was starvation on a massive scale. The party, never thinking too deeply, once had the people going on a huge sparrow-killing campaign since sparrows ate crops. What happened? There was an insect explosion and the insects ate the crops. At the time, some cadres were in fact writing to Mao talking about such widespread devastation, the brave ones anyway, and while Mao did sometimes slow down production, people kept on dying in huge numbers. Then to build all this marvelous industry, Mao needed tools and technology in China. The best place to buy these things, of course, was Russia, and buy he did, as well as sending massive amounts of grain over to the Soviet Union. That was the grain the people needed to survive on. But no problem, because when cadres did the books, it often looked as though the villages still had enough grain for themselves. In time, some party members did talk about the millions of people that were starving and sometimes stated that steel projects and water projects just weren't working. They did say that too much grain was being taken from the countryside to the cities and abroad, but often they ended up either losing their jobs or worse, being sent to prison or killed. Everyone was supposed to think as the vice chairman of the Communist Party Lin Biao did when he denounced those naysayers as anti-party folks and the enemy of the one and true great leader. He said on a stage in 1959, "Only Mao is a great hero, a role to which no one else should dare to aspire. We all lag very far behind him, so don't even think about it." This is why when we talk about the many millions that died in China back then, we can't just blame Mao but much of the machinery of the men behind him. Still, he was the boss. He was the one that could have reversed things. In Fuyang, 2.4 million people died in total from 1959 to 1961 out of a population of 8 million. In Guangshan in 1959 alone, 1 in every 4 of the 600,000 people had died from starvation. In Xinjiang, 1 million people died. Mass graves were everywhere. 67,000 of them had died from being beaten with sticks. There, local militias stole the little food there was and didn't take kindly to anyone complaining that they had none. Some officials did see this happening, with one report stating bad people have seized power, causing beatings, deaths, grain shortages, and hunger. But get this, the report said it was not the fault of Communist Party policies, but because all the rightists that had stirred up trouble and caused havoc in these little towns and villages. All those deaths, the report said, were down to the enemies of the party. Sure, there were counter-revolutionaries around, but most of them were just desperate as hell. They were watching their families grow thin and die. They were being worked to death and their grain was being sent elsewhere. What were they supposed to do? In short, this was an agricultural nightmare, and you can blame the Great Leap Forward for that. There were also some other matters such as failed harvests that resulted in mass deaths, but the party could take most of the blame, especially as so many officials were afraid to report anything negative lest they be seen as counter-revolutionaries. In the villages, the houses of people were torn down to become fuel for the never-ending quotas of supplies. That left people not just without food, but without a roof over their heads. If they complained, they were usually beaten vigorously, sometimes to death. In Hunan alone, 40% of the houses were torn down, and occupants were told they had to make do with whatever they could find to protect themselves from the elements. Mao knew about this. He'd been told in a letter written by another party official named Liu Shaoqi. It didn't matter. Mao just saw this as another small setback. The journalist Yang Jisheng wrote a book based on interviews of the people that had lived through this horrible experience. In one story, someone told him that 13 children went to an official and pleaded for some food. The kids were subsequently taken far away to a mountainous area, and all of them died from exposure. Jisheng wrote, "I was 18 at the time and I only knew what the Communist Party told me. Everyone was fooled." He said every tree around his village was stripped of its bark because the bark was the only thing to eat. In other cases, villagers ripped out weeds and wildflowers and baked them in mud pies. It stopped the hunger but made them very sick. Jisheng's book was later banned in China, to which he responded with the words, "It's an offense to the memories of tens of millions." People walked away from their destroyed villages in the hope of finding anything to eat. Many sold their clothes on these long walks just for the smallest amount of food. In the winter, this was deadly, but bodies were also useful. There's a report from the Shandong archives that says local cadres used the dead as fertilizer. In another village of 45 people, 44 died from starvation. The last remaining woman was found having gone completely insane. In another village, a teenage orphan killed her own younger brother and ate him. Sometimes the dead were dug up and cooked with hot peppers to disguise the taste of rotten meat. One time, a cadre reported to an official what was going on, to which he received the reply, "That's right deviationist thinking. You're viewing the problem in an overly simplistic manner." All of these stories were taken from the Chinese archives and used in books on Mao, some of which we have in front of us now. In one book, in the chapter called Survival, it talks about how some of those local cadres lived like pigs and ate to their heart's content as the people died around them. Others turned to crime. In one province alone, in a period of just 2 months, 500 granaries were robbed. On top of that, the trains carrying the grain were often held up and their contents taken by desperate thieves. Sometimes, when the cadres announced a new unrealistic grain quota at a time when people were starving, there was a rebellion, and the leading figures were cut to pieces by meat cleavers and beaten with sticks. But what could people do? Some just left the villages in what became a large exodus and tried to make it to the cities. Many of them were dying on the way. This is the story of one family that was on such a trek when they stopped in front of a man who had food. The father, Wu Jingqi, gave away his 9-year-old kid for a bowl of rice and some peanuts. In another case, a mother named Wang Weitong sold her son for a couple of pennies and 4 steamed buns. We must remember here that the mother and father may well have done this not just for the food, but thinking that the new owners of the children might help them survive. Another story from Jinghong tells us that a mother and her young child tried to escape from an irrigation project. Both were bayoneted to death on the spot. In another case, the folks that tried to run were rounded up and stuffed in a house that was then blown up with dynamite. Many people were just turned back when they actually made it to the city. In 1960, 380,000 peasants were turned away from Sichuan, and really, where did they have to go? They'd already risked life and limb to get there. The factories in the cities themselves were horrific places to work, but they were better than eating boiled leather, tree bark, your mother, or your brother. In the factories, women had it the worst. They went months without washing in many cases, and venereal disease was rife. One pregnant woman one day didn't turn up to work, presumably because she was sick. When she next appeared at the factory, she was told to take all her clothes off and go and break ice outside in the cold. For men and women, being stripped naked seemed to have been a common kind of humiliating punishment, and this was supposed to be progress. You'd think in Asian culture the elderly would have been respected and cared for, but they were often just left to die. They died much quicker too, given their bodies were not as strong as the young. Just as the young had to lift heavy objects and work from sunrise to sundown, in the eyes of the party, the elderly had to do their bit too. Often, they weren't strong enough to join an exodus. In one village in Hubei, everyone had left a once bustling place. When someone found the village, it was deadly quiet. 4 out of the 6 people left behind were old. They were barely surviving by eating grass and leaves. Do you want to hear more? We could go on, and we must admit, due to the sensibilities of YouTube, we've left out some of the more disturbing details. We've also not included the many disease deaths or the many industrial accidents, such as collapsed mines built too quickly run by despicable cadres. We didn't talk about the deaths at the gulags, or for that matter, the thousands executed there and the hundreds of thousands that died from malnutrition in the gulags. And what about regular violence? The cadres had a saying they liked to use: kill a chicken to scare the monkey. That basically meant show people you'll use extreme violence and other folks will think twice about getting out of line. The stick was often a weapon of choice. Shockingly, people suffering from starvation-related edema were hit with sticks, with the expression used, beating the water out of them. That meant the liquid building up in them was beaten out. One official said, if you want to become a party member, you must know how to beat people. An investigation team from Beijing once arrived at a village and called what they saw a torture field. On one reservoir project in Huangkai, 4,000 from 16,000 villagers were beaten. A quarter of them died. There were indeed killing fields everywhere. One boy was beaten to death for stealing a tiny bit of wheat. In Huan, 300 people were accused of one winter's day of not working hard enough, and they were all told to strip and work. 1 in 7 of them died. Sometimes those accused of slacking were branded with hot irons or pierced with needles. One entire family was forced to sit in a vat of excrement after the father had tried to steal a sweet potato for them. He died 3 weeks later after more punishment, which included being force-fed that poop. In Hunan, there was a report of a whole family being bricked up in a house and left to die. A similar thing had happened to other families. The head of the province, Zhou Xiaozhou, at least ordered an investigation after he'd found out. In another report from Daoshan, it showed many thousands had died. 10% of them had been buried alive. In another report, a man in Hunan village was forced by boss Zhao Desheng to bury his own son alive just because the son had tried to steal a morsel of grain. The archival report said the father died from grief 3 weeks later. Not all the cadres were that brutal. In one province, 260 of them lost their jobs for not beating the people hard enough. 30 of those cadres died from their beating. The numbers are debated, but we do know that the number of deaths ranged from 30 to 45 million. Over the normal number of deaths in China. Around 2 to 3 million were tortured to death or executed. Some scholars put the total number at 55 million deaths, which alone makes Mao's run in charge as one of the most horrific disasters in the history of humankind. People still argue about the numbers, but no one denies millions died needlessly and often violently. Mao knew what was happening. In the minutes of a secret meeting held in Shanghai on March 25, 1959, it was revealed that he said, "When there's not enough to eat, people starve to death. It's better to let half the people die so the other half can eat their fill." But he wasn't done with death, not by a long way. In January 1962, the man we've already mentioned, named Liu Shaoqi, stood in front of cadres in Beijing at the 7,000 Cadres Conference. Shaoqi spoke the truth and said what had happened could have been prevented. The disaster had been man-made. This was some pronouncement given the pervasive fear that had throttled China for years. Mao took partial responsibility and stepped down from leadership, and Shaoqi stepped up. Again, cutting a long story short, let's just say that Mao would get his own back on Shaoqi, but that was after he took control of something called the Cultural Revolution. Starting in 1966, Mao used this revolution to silence his critics and monopolize control. He would make himself a god. He'd drum up the anger of young people all over China to do his often violent bidding. So you won't be surprised to hear that Shaoqi was later denounced by Mao as an enemy and a traitor, and he was beaten on a few occasions while being denied his much-needed medicine. He died soon after, but many years later would end up at least being judged more fairly and have the renegade, traitor, and scab accusation removed from his name. But how did Mao manage to turn things around after falling foul of the party and before that ruining a country? Well, he used propaganda on a large part of the public who for the most part were not that educated. Remember Mao's famous words, "To read too many books is harmful." Mao wanted people to read from the right books. He wanted people to read his own philosophy, what became known as Maoism. The working class folks and poor farmers were still living perilously close to abject poverty. So when a seemingly strong leader told them that he was behind them in their struggles, they grabbed hold of those words out of desperation. Mao was clever. He told the nation that they needed to learn from a deceased soldier named Li Feng. This is called mythology making, a dictator's ace in the hole. Feng had died at the age of 21, but he left behind a diary. Inside this war hero's book were entries that talked about the proletarian struggle and the rise of a wonderful country. And guess who had inspired him the most? Mao, of course. One entry went, "Yesterday I had a dream. I dreamt of seeing Chairman Mao. Like a compassionate father, he stroked my head. With a smile, he spoke to me. Do a good job in your studies. Be forever loyal to the party, loyal to the people." Mao would tell huge crowds that the nation needed to listen to heroes like this man who'd given his life for the common good. Yeah, you want to throw up right now, but it actually worked. The only thing is, Li Feng was a work of propaganda. It's almost certain no man with this name wrote that stuff in a diary, and it's possible Feng never existed at all. And that's why it pays to read books about propaganda techniques throughout history. Plays and movies were made about this fictional lad who loved his Chairman Mao. Songs about him moved an entire nation. One of them included the lyrics, "Don't forget what to love and what to hate. Learn from Feng's good example. Be willing to make a revolution. The collective ideology shines. Remember Chairman Mao's guidance in your hearts. The revolution will last forever." Meanwhile, Mao lived in luxury as his so-called people ate scraps. He preached about embracing the struggle and wore expensive robes. He taught people to embrace stoicism just as fiction Feng had, as he ate like a king. Girls were regularly told they had to go visit the chairman in his bedroom. As one writer stated, their numbers increased as their age decreased, and several left his room with an STD. The writer added, the illness transmitted by Mao was a badge of honor, testimony to their close relations with the chairman. Mao went a step further in 1966, starting a campaign that you could compare to something that happens on social media platforms today. He started a poster campaign, so everywhere a person went, they saw pictures showing this great leader, or his devoted people putting their fists in the air in support of this ideal man. This was the same man who had led his country in a bloodbath. He then attacked the people he said were to blame for the country's problems. These were the traitors, and many of them were intellectuals, teachers, folks who might have been mentally armed against his propaganda. That meant that there was a problem in the universities for Mao. People learned in those places about history and cultures of the world. Mao didn't really like that. He partly blamed the Ministry of Culture. One time he decided it was time to change its name and he came up with, we kid you not, the Ministry of Gifted Scholars and Beautiful Ladies. Then he thought, I really hate them reading about other cultures, so he came up with the name, the Ministry of Foreign Dead People. About 1 month later, he was still going on about how these dead folks from history were dangerous to the cause. We might recall here a great writer who had watched the horrors of the world wars and authoritarianism and saw in his crystal ball the future of endless conflicts and even the widespread use of drones. His name was George Orwell. In his book 1984, he wrote of an authoritarian government called Big Brother and how it controlled the thoughts of a nation. A famous phrase went, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Orwell was long dead before Mao's Cultural Revolution, but Mao's education policies were indeed kind of Orwellian thought police. Mao wanted to control truth, and to do it, he had to rewrite history and get rid of anyone who had what he perceived as the wrong kind of thoughts. Like Stalin had done, he took control of the arts. His big brother face was everywhere. He vilified intellectualism. And then he spread around one of the most read books in history. That was his Little Red Book, which included 267 aphorisms that he said ordinary people should live by. It included these lines. War is a continuation of politics, and there are at least two types, just, progressive, and unjust wars, which only serve bourgeois interests. While no one likes war, we must remain ready to wage just wars against imperialist agitation. An army that is cherished and respected by the people and vice versa is a nearly invincible force. The army and the people must unite on the grounds of basic respect. Young people carried it everywhere. They had it in their pockets when they marched into schools and dragged out their former teachers, accusing them of being rightist and imperialist running dogs and spies. Things were about to get very ugly. These students formed their own Red Guard, and they walked into schools and pulled out teachers by their hair, who they accused of being enemies to the cause. They beat them and humiliated them and tortured them. Mao's young followers said they were born with pure red blood, and their mission in life was to hunt down the bourgeoisie traitors. They did that at the 3rd Middle School for Girls in Beijing, when they dragged out the principal and beat him to death. They left a message on the wall, "Long live the Red Terror." Soon after, at Beijing Teachers College, they took a female teacher and kicked her down the stairs, killing her. In other schools, where the kids doing the bullying were no older than 13, they ganged up on their teachers and forced them to swallow excrement. All over the place, these educated teachers were deemed dangerous intellectuals. The students murdered a woman named Lao Shi, and then they went to her father's house. This guy named Nan Baoshan they also beat to death. They beat his son too and locked him in the house, where he later died of thirst. Again, all these stories are taken from the Chinese archives. Hundreds were clubbed to death, stabbed, kicked down the stairs, throughout Beijing and on its peripheries. The nightmare of violence was back again. The old world had to die, they said, and blood had to be spilled to make a new world. Persecution spread all over the country, with around 400,000 educated people being told they had to leave the cities where they lived, usually after being beaten. It was a reign of terror. Their social media of the day was putting up photographs of traitors or writing their names on walls and calling for their removal. These people waved their little red books in the air and shouted slogans supporting their brilliant and selfless leader. More years passed and more people were accused of being reactionary capitalists and spies, nothing more than agents of the bad people in the West. Just to give you an idea of the carnage, in just the province of Yunnan, the witch hunts took the lives of 17,000 people and, according to one book, crippled another 61,000. Many towns fell under the suspicion of not allying with the cause, especially if a religious minority lived there. Thousands of Mongols were beaten to death, many more were made homeless. The Red Guard filled up trucks where they traveled great distances to do their worst. They barely had food to eat and even did their toilet in these trucks, all for the great cause. Hundreds of thousands of people from the cities were forced into the countryside where they had no idea how to survive. Many of them lived perilously close to starvation. What did clerks and teachers and accountants know about farming? More purges followed. In Hubei alone, 173,000 people were under investigation for what was said to be counter-revolutionary activities. Anyone really, especially educated folks, were investigated. Even party members were under suspicion, and they could soon find themselves doing hard labor or slowly dying in a dark prison cell. If you wanted to keep power as a dictator, just as paranoid Stalin had done, you needed to clean house often. Who knows how many people were murdered during these very bleak and black years? Estimates differ wildly, with the lowest number being put at 250,000 deaths, but the highest at 2 million. As for those city dwellers that were beaten and forced to go live in the countryside, estimates put the number at 10 million. How many so-called bad elements were beaten badly, publicly humiliated, harassed so much that they couldn't take it anymore, that number's huge alone, or lost every material item they had in life? We're talking about a significant amount of a very large population, an incomprehensible figure, and all because of one man. After the death of Stalin, Mao had feared the people of the Soviet Union would turn against hardcore communism. Stalin might have dissed Mao when they met, but Mao still looked up to him. Then, when Mao saw the new leader Khrushchev denounce Stalin and his deathly purges, Mao of course wondered if he too might be denounced. Mao knew he needed his reign of terror to hold on to power. Just as the French revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre had said, you have to strike terror into the hearts of the people. And back to Orwell and something he called doublespeak, both Robespierre and Mao said terror equals virtue. Mao saw himself as being the pinnacle of communism all over the world. He once explained his idea of virtue, saying, "Our objective is to struggle against and crush those persons in authority who are taking the capitalist road, so as to facilitate the consolidation and development of the socialist system." He was a dictator that caused a great famine and whose ideas led to people in the countryside killing and eating their own families. His idealism led to 20th century witch hunts that saw innocent people beaten to death with sticks by an angry mob of young folks who had no idea they'd been brainwashed. And guess who one of his victims was? Whose family was humiliated and beaten and forced to move to the countryside. His name? Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader. His sister died as a result of the disgusting humiliation she experienced, and his mother was forced to denounce his father. The father was then sent to a prison, and Xi, just aged 15, was sent to the countryside where he and the rest of his now distraught family had to live in a cave. So, surely, Mao must have come under an avalanche of criticism in more recent times. He died, by the way, in 1976, and the Cultural Revolution died with him, even though it had petered out before that. It seems some powerful elements in China don't embrace the adage, "Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it." In 2017, there were reports of Chinese scholars and others losing their jobs for criticizing Mao. And while Xi has at times talked about more criticism of the past being needed, too much criticism is not good when authoritarianism reigns. Certain words in some places can get you in big trouble, just as the man Orwell had warned with those immortal words, "In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." Arm yourselves with knowledge, viewers, so you don't become a weapon for someone with dangerous ideas. If you listen to the media, the world is currently in a pitched battle for control between rival superpowers, the United States and China. Is the United States on the decline? Is it truly going to be a Chinese century as China reaches the same level as the United States and potentially surpasses it? The tale of the tape is very different, and surprisingly, China may not be a superpower at all. In some ways, China and the United States do match up pretty competitively. China has a much larger population than the US, almost 4 times as many people. They control a similar amount of land, allowing both to dominate their continent. Both have significant holdings abroad in financial investments, but the US has a global military while China has only one major foreign military outpost in Djibouti. In terms of military strength, China is the only country that is seen as a near peer to the United States. They both have modern intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. While America has a much larger nuclear arsenal than China, China still retains the ability to strike the US homeland, and unlike Russia's massive Cold War-era arsenal, these missiles are modern and known to be working. But the definition of a superpower is a specific thing, and China is not there yet. The term superpower was first created in 1944 during the Second World War, and it referred to a state that was dominant and powerful enough to exert influence and project power across the world. When it was first coined, it referred to 3 countries with massive empires or puppet states around the world: the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Not only are these states powerful enough to have an impact around the world, but no international action can really be taken without consulting these superpowers first. This made them largely invincible. They only had one weakness: time. This trio of superpowers wouldn't stay that way for long. The United Kingdom saw its mighty empire, which spanned the world at its peak, collapse in the decades after World War II. While the UK is still a powerful nuclear-armed nation, it doesn't have nearly as much power on the world stage as it used to. For a while, the US and the USSR were about as close to global equals as you could get until the USSR saw its communist government fall, and many of the countries it had conquered split off from its sphere of influence. Its current leader, Vladimir Putin, has no problem acting like Russia is still a superpower, but he learned a harsh lesson when his invasion of Ukraine ground to a halt while the rest of the world threw their money and support toward Ukraine. Russia's also found itself under sanctions and cut off from much of the global economy, showing that today's Russia is nowhere near as influential as the USSR. Then that leaves the United States standing alone, the world's superpower, right? Many have talked about the decline of the US on the world stage, with recent events not helping to inspire confidence that the state will remain the #1 spot. But is that actually impacting its global prestige and influence? Not really. After all, it's still a key member of NATO, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and by far the largest economy in the world. Its military spending is the highest in the world, and its military is state-of-the-art and only getting stronger. If anything, the fear over the US's seemingly instability might be because people see it as an indispensable global cop. Who knows what would happen if its leadership fell into the wrong hands, or if the country became involved in another bloody civil war. And it's not clear if there would be anyone to pick up the slack. China's rise has gained a lot of attention recently, as the Asian nation established itself as a dominant regional power and started making moves outside of Asia. It continues to claim Taiwan as part of its territory, but hasn't made direct moves against the island nation. Its artificial islands in the South China Sea have caused conflict with neighbors like Vietnam, and most of the time China wins these standoffs due to no one else in the region having the military might to challenge its navy. And further away, China's powerful economic sector means it has extensive leverage over other countries, potentially cutting them off from essential supplies if they cross it. And their heavy investments in Africa means that the continent could become a staunch ally in the future. All this put together makes China look like a superpower on the rise, but looks can be deceiving. During the early part of the 21st century, China's rise was the talk of the world, and they certainly acted like they were expanding fast. But since then, a lot of factors have converged to stop the country's rise in its tracks. The first and potentially biggest is a growing population time bomb. While China is still currently the largest country in the world by population, it's expected to lose that title as early as 2023 to India, largely due to China's very low birth rate. This is partially due to China's extended one-child policy, which lasted for decades and led to many couples having only one boy. That left China with a massive gender gap, and many young Chinese men were left without wives, nicknamed bare branches by the media. While the policy has since been rescinded, old habits die hard, and it's rare to see a Chinese family having many kids. As the population ages, that could cause long-term problems. It's not the only ticking time bomb for China's future. China's rise has largely been caused by its economic expansion, something that's become possible when the Chinese Communist Party ended its strict allegiance to Marxism and shifted to a state-run capitalist economy. The country's managed to pick up a lot of the world's manufacturing, particularly of technology, and that's given it a lot of sway. But people are becoming increasingly hesitant to invest in China due to how their products are made, often by prisoners with little to no safety protections. As the internet made it easier for news to spread around the world in an instant, it became harder and harder for China to keep its secrets, and that means China could see its ace in the hole become a pair of twos. Many companies have moved their manufacturing efforts to other countries, with India, South Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan all becoming major hubs in recent decades. This is particularly the case for Taiwan, which now controls the majority of the world's semiconductor production, and those little devices are the key to making just about every modern computerized device run. This may be a big part of the reason China is interested in conquering Taiwan, but unless it pulls it off in a hurry, odds are the rest of the world will rush to defend Taiwan. Which leads to the other big question: could China actually win such a war? China makes a big show of its military strength, frequently conducting war games off Taiwan and placing its ships in neutral waters. But it primarily projects military strength right now in one way: intimidation. Its ships are modern and powerful, but China's huge military hasn't been fully tested in combat in decades. As one of only a few nuclear powers in Asia, and the one with the largest arsenal, it is the biggest bully in the local playground. But is it the biggest bully in town? The answer is probably not, as the US largely outclasses it in military strength. China might be able to win most local conflicts, but if the US gets drawn into the fray, China's choices would likely be back off or threaten the use of nukes. And that paints a pretty clear picture of who the current superpower is. Of course, China's biggest challenges to its potential superpower status might come from within, not from its rivals. China has frequently been mentioned as a potential second superpower, but as the country modernizes, it might actually be less likely to be a superpower. That's because China's population is increasingly educated and politically active, and they realize that they live in a country where they haven't had any real say in how the government is run for over 70 years. In the past, protests against the CCP have been put down rather brutally, but the country hasn't seen anything like the massive protests against the COVID-19 lockdowns in its history. These organized protests have become too much even for the usually tough CCP, and that disease might be China's downfall. When COVID-19 first appeared on the scene and turned the world upside down, China acted fast, locking down its cities where the virus appeared and keeping them locked down until cases died down. But while in many countries a lockdown just meant restaurants were closed and there were lines outside of every grocery store, in China they locked down and meant it. It was illegal to leave your home in many places, with lockdowns extending for weeks and even months. The initial lockdowns were deemed a success, and when the virus returned, so did the lockdowns. Even 2.5 years into the pandemic, major cities were being locked down under the same stringent rules as 2020, and the people had enough. Currently, the Chinese Communist Party faces the stiffest challenge to its rule it's ever seen, with mass numbers of young protesters showing up, waving blank papers to represent the way the country is silencing them, and to ensure they can't be prosecuted for seditious slogans. The lockdowns have also caused a massive decrease in tourism and investment in China, as outsiders are hesitant to visit when they don't know when it could become impossible to leave for several months due to an outbreak. After all, staying in Shanghai Disneyland sounds like fun until you can't leave, and you're shuffled onto the on-site quarantine camp. Be careful what you wish for, kids. All this has made several past predictions look rather silly. For much of the 21st century, experts were arguing that China's rise was unstoppable and that the country might even surpass the US to become the world's largest economy and most powerful military. Even in the United States, military analysts observed China's dominance over the Indo-Pacific has led them to become a superpower. China certainly views itself as one in the way it projects its power in the region, but its only influence outside of its own sphere is only created through economic deals, and if those slow down, China will find itself confined to being a regional power in an area with a lot of fast-rising rivals. Is the high ride really over for China? As far back as 10 years ago, some analysts were saying they believed China would never become a superpower. They pointed to a lot of factors, including China's aging population and increasing dissatisfaction with their government, and they identified one other major problem. China's fast industrialization has left it one of the most polluted countries in the world, with several major cities having hazardous air quality. That could impact the quality of life for its residents as they get older, and combined with a low birth rate, could mean China would see a massive decrease in its working-age population within a few decades. Another factor is China's dependence on the global economy. While China has a strong economy based on manufacturing, it needs customers to keep that going, and countries are increasingly hesitant to do business in China. This is due to COVID policies, ethics issues, and the history of China arresting foreign businessmen and journalists. If the bottom falls out of China's trade deals, the country could find itself dealing with a shortage of energy and raw materials, which could cause greater instability in the country and more protests that could eventually put an end to the Chinese Communist Party's rule. And it all might come back to one big question: do people want to move to China? Despite people yelling, "They took our jobs," immigrants are essential to a country's welfare. This is partially due to needing a workforce if the domestic supply of workers isn't enough to replace those leaving the workforce. But it's also the equivalent of a high-powered sports draft. If a genius immigrates to your country and sets up a new business there, it could be a multi-billion-dollar boon. Chinese-American professor Amy Chua argued that China will have a problem attracting immigrants in the future due to other countries having greater incentives. The country's authoritarian tactics and uncertain future might be other roadblocks. And the worst part is, few of these factors are likely to change. For China to become a superpower, it would need to keep building on its successes, but the opposite is actually likely to happen. All of China's major problems are like a ball rolling downhill. The population bomb they're facing is a demographic issue that'll take a long time to reverse, if it's even possible to do it. While China's actively trying to boost birth rates now, they're not seeing much success. The same goes for China's problem with attracting talent from outside its borders. Barring a complete overhaul in the government's approach to public affairs, it's likely that immigrants and corporations will be hesitant to invest in the country. The only thing that could change this is a massive overhaul in China's system of government. And if that happens, the future would still look uncertain. Say China's massive student protests continue and eventually bear fruit. Much like in Russia during the 1980s, they got a new leader who takes real movements toward reform. Democracy is introduced and people get a say. And eventually the CCP ends its grip over the country and allows something new to take its place. This is a massive change and one that will likely turn China's focus inward for the better part of a decade. The CCP's expansionist efforts will go on the back burner, and a China in flux will be less likely to seek military conflict. Foreign investors will likely be waiting to see which way the wind will blow before making heavy investments. The result might be a stronger, more free China that's able to better compete on the global stage. But it'll take a while to get there, and that'll mean China gets further and further away from being a global superpower while the US continues to consolidate its role. So, is the US likely to remain the sole superpower indefinitely? At first glance, it seems likely. After all, China is the closest competitor, and it looks like it's getting further and further away. Russia is increasingly isolated and looking like a cornered animal. The fastest growing country in the world, India, might be a contender, but with its focus still internal, and it has a serious border conflict with its nuclear neighbor Pakistan. While it's likely to evolve into a great power over the coming decades, it's not clear if it even wants to become a superpower. India has so far shown little ambition for expansionism, and in many rural areas it still shows characteristics of a developing nation, like a low literacy rate. But the most likely candidate to be a rival superpower might not be a country at all, exactly. With a population of 446 million, it's only behind China and India. With an area of 1.6 million square miles, it's only behind Russia in area. It's the European Union, the massive political union of 27 member states that covers most of Western Europe and is still growing. While it recently lost Britain as a member state, it has many other countries looking to potentially join. It has a nuclear power amongst its members in France, and all its states have a high Human Development Index indicating high life expectancy and education levels. If Russia's expansion into Ukraine and beyond is foiled, the EU could become the biggest winner, looking like an inviting option for any country worried about being targeted by Russia. Would it eventually be a rival to the United States? The biggest stumbling block might be a lack of a unified foreign policy and a modest military presence. But if its power continues to grow, the member states might eventually move toward greater integration to become a more cohesive unit. And given that most nations in the EU have close relations with the United States, it's possible the two superpowers could become a dominant global alliance. Cell phones made in Latin America, supply chains contained in the Western Hemisphere, Asian companies fleeing to Mexico. These are some of China's worst nightmares, and unfortunately for Beijing, everything we've just listed will likely happen. Over the past 2 decades, whenever you look at where a product was produced, the same 3 words stared back at you: Made in China. But this might not be the case for much longer. In a few years, you could be checking the back of your most prized possessions and see the words Made in Mexico. Will this economic shift bring China to its knees? Could Mexico become a dominant player in a global economy? Let's find out. There are several key reasons why Mexico has become a prominent player in global manufacturing recently. Some of it has to do with external factors such as rising tensions between China and the US, along with massive supply chain issues due to the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine. However, there are also some key aspects of Mexico's society and its geography that have allowed the nation to secure its position as an up-and-coming economic power in the future. Foreign investments and businesses have flocked to Mexico when they once looked to China for much of their supply and manufacturing. There are 4 main reasons why there's so much talk of Mexico one day replacing China as a key manufacturer for companies worldwide. The first is that Mexico is in a prime location. The second is that it can provide stability where others can't. The third is because the country has a large labor pool and low wages. And the fourth is that Mexico has the flexibility other nations don't. The rise of Mexico as a contender to China began several years ago. However, the history of Mexico as a major trade partner and an ally of the US goes back much further. And since the US has the largest economy in the world with a GDP of around $23.3 trillion a year, this is a big deal. The foundation of the relationship between Mexico and the US got off to a rocky start. The Mexican-American War, or Guerra de 1847, came to an end when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. Mexico was given approximately $18 million in compensation from the United States, and the U.S. received Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, along with parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Needless to say, this wasn't exactly a fair deal. After the war, the governments of the 2 nations remained somewhat indifferent to one another, but economic trade and ties quickly began to form between the 2 neighbors. Between 1882 and 1910, U.S. railroad companies recruited workers from Mexico as labor shortages sprung up across the United States. This was partly thanks to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which stopped immigration from China at the time. It's estimated that more than 16,000 Mexicans were working on the railroads during the early 20th century and made up as much as 60% of the U.S. railway workforce. So even after 100 years, there were disputes and shifting power balances between the United States, China, and Mexico. The situation today is much different than that of the past, but the economies of all 3 nations have always been somewhat intertwined. In 1965, the end of the temporary worker program in the United States resulted in hundreds of thousands of migrant workers going back to Mexico. The Mexican government established a large-scale industrial development program that was focused on manufacturing near the U.S.-Mexico border to allow for easy movement of goods and components between the countries. These facilities were called maquiladoras, or assembly plants, and employed severely underpaid Mexican laborers to build goods for the U.S. market. There was a huge influx of workers from southern Mexico that headed north to work in the maquiladoras, and by 1992, around 500,000 people were employed at the assembly plants, which produced around $19 billion worth of goods and services, or around 40% of Mexico's total exports. This move to grow the economic output of Mexico through the maquiladoras became known as the Mexican Miracle and resulted in sustained economic growth of between 3 and 4% for almost 3 decades. It is this foundation that would eventually lead Mexico to where it is today, who, to put it bluntly, is stealing contracts and business away from China. On January 1, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was signed and went into effect. This started a 15-year process of dismantling tariffs and levies between the Mexican and United States and Canadian governments. The agreement greatly increased the cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. There were many societal problems that stemmed from NAFTA, but economists generally agree the deal did help with economic growth by nearly tripling North American trade. NAFTA played a major role in helping the Mexican economy grow and allowing it to be in the unique position it is today. There's a lot to unpack between the United States and Mexico, especially when it comes to border policies and cultural differences, but that's a topic for another time. What's important to know is that after NAFTA, the US and Mexico changed leaders several times, but trade and economic cooperation between the two nations continued. Then in 2020, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement replaced NAFTA, further solidifying and extending the free trade agreement between the three nations. The relationship between the US and Mexican governments is built around economic gains, with each nation looking out for itself. What this means is that when the US benefits, Mexico benefits, and vice versa. We can use this fact to springboard to how things are beginning to go very badly for China and why Mexico is benefiting so greatly from their losses. As of 2023, Mexico has become the United States' leading trade partner, beating both Canada and China for the top spot. Approximately $263 billion worth of goods passed between the US-Mexico border for the first 4 months of 2023. Mexican exports to the U.S. totaled around $157 billion, while exports from U.S. to Mexico reached $107 billion. 15.4% of all U.S. trade was done with Mexico, followed by 15.2% with Canada and 12% with China. These numbers are intriguing because in 2022, 7.5% of all U.S. exports were imported by China, and 16.5% of total U.S. imports came from China. China was actually the U.S.'s leading trade partner since 2014 when it took the #1 spot from Canada. 2023 is one of the few times Mexico has been the top trade partner of the U.S. in recent history, but this might become the new norm. There are two major factors that have led to Mexico replacing China as the U.S.'s top trade partner. The first is the clash between the two titans. Washington, D.C. and Beijing have always been at odds with one another. Their relationship is built on economic gains, but their ideologies could not be more different. The second is the growth of Mexico as an economic power. Let's start by discussing what happened between China and the U.S. and how it led to Mexico getting a leg up. Trade between the United States and China began to run into trouble in 2018 when President Donald Trump's administration started to enact tariffs on Chinese imports as punishment for Beijing and Chinese companies that were stealing U.S. intellectual property. In response, China implemented its own tariffs on U.S. goods. This pissing match went back and forth for a while, resulting in around $335 billion in trade, or around 66.4% of China's exports to the U.S. being subject to tariffs. The average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods is approximately 19.3%, while Beijing has settled on an average tariff of 21.2% on American goods, according to the World Trade Organization. The result of this tariff war was an 8.5% reduction in trade from China to the U.S. and a 26.3% reduction in trade from the U.S. to China. And since the Biden administration hasn't rolled back any of the tariffs imposed by Trump, it allowed both Canada and Mexico to once again vie for the top trade position with the largest economy in the world. It's become too expensive for many U.S. companies to import products from China and keep their costs competitive. This has resulted in many businesses looking elsewhere to secure goods and labor, which has only exacerbated China's decrease in trade with the U.S. As of May 2023, the United States has carried out $68.7 billion worth of trade in Mexico, $67.6 billion with Canada, and $46.6 billion with China. This accounts for 15.9%, 15.7%, and 10.8% respectively of total trade done with the U.S. COVID-19 put the final nail in the coffin for the U.S.-China trade relations when supply chain issues started to develop as global shipping and logistics became paralyzed by the pandemic. It is possible that the tariffs, pandemic, and supply chain issues created the perfect storm, which could lead to the fall of the Chinese manufacturing economy and the rise of Mexico. Before we dive into what Mexico has been doing to overtake China as the U.S.'s top trade partner, we need to discuss how China may actually be its own worst enemy. For decades, China's been able to outcompete much of the global competition for low-cost manufacturing. This brought huge amounts of investment and money into the country, which allowed its economy to grow rapidly. However, the result of this influx of cash meant that China and its people were becoming wealthier, which led to many workers expecting higher pay. Over the course of 2 decades, the income and GDP per capita in China rose tenfold. Quality of life within its borders improved, and a middle class developed. But as China found success and its citizens started to expect higher pay, manufacturing costs began to rise. It made sense for foreign companies to do business with China when it was cost-effective, but for some, this was no longer the case, which is why companies are now looking elsewhere to find cheaper labor. And one country that stands out above all the rest is Mexico. Let's now look at how much is being invested in Mexico and what this influx of business has done to improve the country's economy and the manufacturing capabilities. The industries receiving the most investments in Mexico are the pharmaceutical and automotive sectors, followed by the food industry. Companies are also looking at Mexico to secure mining rights and access to basic metals. Prime examples of this influx of foreign businesses are Ford investing $260 million to build a new global technology and business center in Mexico, and Volkswagen investing nearly $763 million in an electric vehicle plant in the country. In November 2022, Economy Minister Raquel Buenrostro Sanchez announced that more than 400 North American companies have the intention of relocating from Asia to Mexico. So it is clear that there has been a shift in where companies, especially from the US, are doing business. But it isn't just Western firms that are moving to Mexico. Chinese corporations are also moving to Mexico to take advantage of the nation's key assets and to provide greater access to North American markets. It's been reported that Chinese investment into Mexico increased from $154 million in 2016 before the Trump administration to $271 million. This was nearly a 50% increase in response to the US threatening China with tariffs the following year. By 2021, Chinese companies invested $492.5 million in Mexico as the country's allure became harder and harder to ignore. Now let's get into how Mexico is replacing China, at least in several aspects of the global market. As mentioned earlier, there are four main reasons why this is happening. They are location, geopolitical stability, labor pool, and flexibility. We'll examine each one and analyze how these factors have contributed to Mexico becoming one of the most crucial economies in the world. Location. Mexico's proximity to the US gives it a huge advantage over other nations around the world when it comes to foreign investment. For the US, Mexico provides an excellent alternative to China in terms of production and manufacturing. The proximity of Mexico has allowed for what's called nearshoring. Basically, this is moving supply chains, manufacturing, and trade closer to home. And for the United States, it does not get much closer than Mexico. The theory is that by nearshoring, countries can mitigate lag time in deliveries and reduce the impact of unforeseen global events on supply chains. The shift to conducting more business with Mexico was sped up by the need to procure crucial goods and materials to keep the U.S. economy going during and after the pandemic. China could produce all the goods it wanted, but since the average container ship takes between 15 and 30 days to reach the US, many businesses, especially those that are waiting on key components or parts, have been looking for other alternatives. Then there's the fact that almost all shipping was shut down during the pandemic, and backed up supply took months to unload. This problem could have been averted if US businesses relied on Mexico as their main supplier and business partner, and not only would the goods be closer, but also much easier to ship. Just to put this into perspective, China's busiest port in Shanghai is 6,500 miles or 10,500 kilometers from Los Angeles, where most Asian goods enter the U.S. Ford's car plant in Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico is only 664 miles or 1,068 kilometers from Los Angeles and takes under 12 hours to reach by truck. So, getting goods and resources from Mexico to the United States is not only faster but cheaper as well. And this is just one example. There are countless manufacturing facilities across Mexico, some of which are only miles from the U.S. border. The possibility for U.S. companies to significantly shrink the distance between where their products are produced by moving to Mexico seems like a no-brainer. In fact, goods manufactured in Mexico can be loaded on a truck and be anywhere in the U.S. within 5 days. The only way Chinese imports could make it to the U.S. in 5 days would be if they were loaded onto a cargo plane and flown across the Pacific. This is just not a cost-effective way of doing business. Another advantage that Mexico has due to its proximity to the U.S. is increased reliability. Businesses know their products from Mexico will almost always be delivered on time. Those same goods coming from China could run into all kinds of delays, from bad weather during the ocean crossing to problems and holdups at port. There's a much higher risk for products to arrive late when coming from Asia than if they're thrown into a truck in Mexico and driven across the border. But the U.S. is not the only country that benefits from the location of Mexico. Since it's so close to the United States, Mexico's policies and government structure has been influenced by the superpower to its north over time. This can be seen as either good or bad, but the fact of the matter is that politically speaking, Mexico is much more aligned with Western democracies than China is. This means that some governments are more willing to do business with Mexico just on principle. Mexico is also closer to the growing economies in South America, which means Mexican exports arrive much quicker than if they're procured from Asia. Then there's the World Trade Bridge, or Puente Internacional Comercio Mundial. that connects Laredo, Texas to Nuevo León, Mexico. What makes this bridge so special is that it's 8 lanes wide for commercial use only. Basically, it's a gateway for goods and products to cross between Mexico and the United States. Around 6,000 trucks use the World Trade Bridge to enter the U.S. every single day. The bridge and connecting infrastructure allows for easy transportation and delivery. These goods can then be sold, used in manufacturing facilities, or even shipped to the rest of the world. Before we move on to the next advantage Mexico has, it's worth mentioning that some companies prefer doing business in Mexico because they can keep a closer eye on manufacturing and distribution. An example of this has to do with compliance over environmental, social, and corporate goals. Companies like Patagonia pride themselves on only sourcing sustainable materials and partnering with businesses that can manufacture their products ethically while also treating workers fairly. This is why, rather than procuring cheap cotton from places like the Xinjiang region of China, where reports of child and slave labor have come to light, companies will buy materials from Mexico or other parts of the world. Having supply chains located in Mexico, U.S. companies can more easily monitor all stages of how their products are being made. The same could be said for companies outside the U.S. who set up their manufacturing centers in Mexico. The Chinese government isn't always the most forthcoming or cooperative when it comes to foreign entities. However, the Mexican government will not actively hinder investigations by companies looking into their investments in the same way Beijing does. And this leads us to our next reason why Mexico could replace China as a global leading manufacturer: geopolitical stability. The disputes and political problems the United States has with China are one of the main reasons that Mexico is becoming a dominant player in the global economy. Some analysts predict the tariffs and the unsteady relationship between Washington and Beijing may result in no fewer than 10 years of steady economic growth for Mexico. The United Nations estimates that around $27 billion of lost trade between the U.S. and China has been picked up by Mexico. It should come as no surprise that the U.S. and many Western powers are concerned about Beijing's expansionist rhetoric and steps the Chinese government's taking to extend its power and influence around the world. Unsurprisingly, the single-party authoritarian rule of Xi Jinping is not the ideal form of government for Western democracies to do business with. However, since Mexico's political system is much more aligned with their own, the West might see it as a safer option to conduct business with Mexico City rather than Beijing. Then there's the fact that Chinese leadership has continued to double down on their claims to Taiwan. This has many governments on edge, as Taiwan is the leading manufacturer of semiconductors. Most governments don't formally recognize Taiwan's independence, but conduct business with Taipei knowing full well it's a sovereign nation. If China were to invade and incorporate Taiwan into its borders, the consequences could be disastrous. This has many companies on edge, as an invasion of Taiwan would inevitably lead to sanctions and could possibly lead to war. Either way, supply chains from China to the rest of the world would be impacted. Blockades and embargoes could keep goods from leaving Chinese ports, putting many companies dependent on Chinese goods in a treacherous position. However, doing business in Mexico doesn't come with the same risk. The geopolitical stances of the Mexican government are much more aligned with the West than Beijing. If in a worst-case scenario China invades Taiwan, business in Mexico will likely continue as usual. Companies that procure their goods from Mexico wouldn't have to worry nearly as much about delays. The peace of mind is enough for some businesses to pull their production out of China and set up shop in Mexico. Perhaps the biggest factor that could result in Mexico replacing China as the world's go-to manufacturing center is this next point: low wages and large workforce. The reason that businesses in the United States and Europe haven't just brought the manufacturing of goods to their own shores is that it's just too expensive. These developed economies have a well-established middle class and labor laws in places that make mass-producing goods a lot less lucrative than outsourcing the process and paying workers in a foreign country a lot less. It's just how capitalism works. The cheaper something can be made, the more profit there is. Companies will almost always do whatever it takes to increase profit, even if it means outsourcing their product and taking advantage of people desperate for work. The Mexican Social Security Institute reported that in 2021, the average income in Mexico was approximately 16,449.22 pesos per month. That translates to about $820. The average monthly income for a worker in the United States in 2021 was around $3,000, which is over 3 times as much as a worker in Mexico. Now, there are a lot more people who live in poverty and are unemployed in Mexico than in the US, which means that not only are wages much lower, but unethical practices sometimes occur. The minimum wage in Mexico is 207.44 pesos, or $11.54 a day. So, although the reported data suggests that Mexican workers make the equivalent of $820 a month, the reality is most workers are probably only bringing in about $230 a month. But when it comes to the manufacturing industry, the statistics change slightly. It's reported that the average income for workers in factories is $3.50 an hour, which is 20 to 40% less than China. Even with lower wages, quality control in Mexico has proven to be more reliable than China. So moving production to Mexico could be a win-win for some companies that aren't specializing in complicated manufacturing processes like high-end electronics. In fact, the cheap cost of labor in Mexico is actually drawing Chinese companies to its competitor. Outside of the small city of Salinas, Victoria in Nuevo León, a gigantic project to build manufacturing centers has begun. The industrial park was funded through a Mexico-China joint cooperation deal and is named Hofusan Industrial Park. Recently, Chinese companies such as Hisense, Kuka Home, Manhua, and Sunon have opened manufacturing center at Hofusan to take advantage of cheap labor and low costs. Around 44 different Asian companies opened manufacturing spaces in Mexico in 2022 alone. This has just added to the already large number of foreign countries, such as Japan, South Korea, and the United States, who are already utilizing the Mexican workforce for their manufacturing capabilities. And as more and more manufacturing is moved to Mexico, wages will start to increase, attracting more and more experienced workers. Since wages have a ways to go until they catch up to the pay rates in China and other parts of the world, there's wiggle room for companies to offer increased incentives to their best workers. Flexibility. Although geopolitical stability is an important aspect of why companies are moving their manufacturing to Mexico, the flexibility that the country provides to its companies is also very attractive. In China, the state has its hands in everything. This means it can be difficult for some businesses to work in the country or manufacture their products the way they see fit. This is less of a problem in Mexico. Some companies, especially in the United States, may be willing to pay more for the manufacturing process in Mexico in return for more supply chain flexibility and confidence in delivery times. With the way things are headed, it seems as if the Mexican economy will continue to grow, and manufacturing there might become more costly in the future. But as long as products and goods are continuously pumped out without disruption, businesses will continue to make a profit. The reality is that even though some resources and aspects of doing business in Mexico can be more expensive than in China, Western companies are willing to pay a premium to have the flexibility to diversify their manufacturing locations. For U.S. companies, Mexico offers much more flexibility because of its location. Around 40% of the materials used in the production process of goods in Mexico come from the United States. This is beneficial for quality control purposes and provides an economic boost to the country itself. Conversely, only 4% of products made in China utilize parts made in the U.S. The question then becomes, why would the U.S. continue to trade with China when there's an extra economic incentive to work with Mexico? The answer is it won't, which is why we've seen a reduction in the amount of trade being done between the US and China. The fact of the matter is that manufacturing in Mexico is better for US companies, the US economy, and therefore the American people. It's worth noting that there are some major problems in Mexico that they still need to overcome if it ever hopes to be as large a manufacturer as China. The first is corruption. Mexico rates 128 out of 180 on the Corruption Perception Index, which is not great. Until the government can get organized crime and the cartels under control, corrupt public officials and the negative perception of Mexico by the outside world will remain unchanged. Mexico also needs to modify its infrastructure and expand its shipping capabilities if it hopes to compete with China. Out of the 50 busiest seaports in the world, none are in Mexico. The largest port in Mexico, the Port of Manzanillo, does 6 times less business than Los Angeles ports. Infrastructure such as roads and railways also need to be improved and developed to allow companies to move goods across the mountains, deserts, and thick jungles of Mexico. So, will Mexico replace China as the manufacturing capital of the world? Probably not anytime soon. There's little doubt that Mexico has a lot going for it, and its economy will continue to grow as more and more companies opt to move their manufacturing to the country. However, China is still a powerhouse. It dominates production in Asia and ships goods across the planet. It's also become the main supplier of huge markets in Africa and South America. What it comes down to is that China might not even care that Mexico's encroaching on the manufacturing side of things. China's become wealthy enough to diversify its businesses, meaning it doesn't have to rely solely on manufactured goods to grow its economy. Countries like India and Vietnam are now producing a lot of products for companies around the world, including China, due to their low labor costs and developed supply chains. And no matter how badly the US wants to get away from China, it just can't. The two economies have become so intertwined and reliant on one another that if either nation cut the other off, it would lead to the economic collapse of countries. However, this isn't to say that the US won't eventually become less and less reliant on China as it turns to Mexico for more of its manufacturing needs. Although it might take time, this seems to be the most likely outcome. China isn't going anywhere. Mexico is almost certainly going to see more businesses coming to its shores for manufacturing incentives, but China will remain a dominant economic and political power. People who live in the United States and Canada will likely see more and more products with Made in Mexico on them, and fewer that come from China. However, the same cannot be said for the rest of the world. The Mexican economy will grow thanks to its location, stability, and cheap labor, but it's an almost certainty the Chinese economy will continue to grow as well. 2027. That's the date predicted by many senior American defense officials for a war with China. The conflict is seen by many as inevitable, and the U.S. has been preparing for its eventuality since President Obama announced the U.S.'s pivot to the Pacific during his second term. Since then, the majority of U.S. naval power has been either repositioned to the Pacific or within easy reach of it, and the U.S. Air Force remains ready to rapidly deploy across an ever-expanding network of bases in the region from which to take the war to China directly. At the heart of the conflict is Taiwan, which could prove to be the most important nation of the 21st century. The island nation is smaller than California, but ranks 21st in GDP worldwide. It's a flourishing democracy situated just 80 miles from one of the most hostile states to global democracies anywhere in the world, and one with the power to challenge Taiwan and anyone who tries to defend it. But the fate of Taiwan isn't just a clash of deals between authoritarianism and democracy, though that too is increasingly important. Since the mid-2010s, the world has been steadily pivoting toward an increasing autocratic bent, thanks to the influence of Russia and China. Both powers who know that the continued survival of their autocratic ruling leaders depends entirely on them recreating the post-World War II liberal world order led by the United States, but with them at the helm. For the Chinese Communist Party, facing increasing criticism both at home and abroad, for everything from the genocide of the Uyghur minority to the stripping away of Chinese personal freedoms, reshaping the world in its own authoritarian image is its only guarantee of survival. To that end, Taiwan is a stumbling block that must be removed. The island democracy sits right off its own shore, and its deep economic and cultural ties to China is an avenue for the spread of pro-democratic sentiments amongst the Chinese people. The island has significant strategic value for both economic and military reasons, though. As most know by now, Taiwan is the world's leading manufacturer of advanced computer microchips, something referred to as Taiwan's Silicon Shield. After the United States began seeking ways to produce chips abroad more cheaply in the latter part of the Cold War and ended most of its domestic production, Taiwan saw an opportunity, and today the nation produces most of the world's microchips and nearly all of the most advanced chips. These chips are as important to modern economies as the trade of spices once was to the global powers in the past ages. It's not just extremely lucrative, but a modern technological economy literally depends on them. Without access to Taiwan's advanced microchips, a nation's economy would be severely impacted. One only need to look to Russia for the effects. The nation has only two companies capable of mass-producing processors, MCST and Baikal Electronics. Both companies worked closely with Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, producing 28 and more modern 16-nanometer chips, though the 16-nanometer chips never hit mass production. Baikal had plans to introduce next-generation processors inside Russia starting in 2023, but with Taiwan following the lead of Western sanctions against Russia, the effort never materialized. Now Russia is only able to produce the much older, less capable microprocessors and specialized processors for use in military applications. The end result is Russia has been locked out of access to modern microchips, and the small amount it's able to smuggle through sanction-busting efforts or with the help of China is not enough to sustain Russian efforts to remain competitive against modern information-driven economies. The effect is also devastating for the Russian defense sector, with its efforts to develop an advanced AI crippled due to a lack of access to advanced microchips. Even if the nation's able to somehow develop homegrown capabilities, an extreme unlikelihood given that Russia's always lagged behind the West in microchip design, it still faces issues with the import of materials needed to create the microchips. In early 2023, Rostec announced it would begin producing its own 150mm and 200mm silicon wafers, yet being cut off from access to the polycrystalline silicon it once purchased from the West resulted in it being unclear by the end of the year when Rostec would actually begin production. China, as a state hostile to Taiwan's existence, is already feeling the pinch of losing access to advanced microchips. President Joe Biden, in conjunction with Japan and the Netherlands, instituted a microchip ban to significantly limit the export of advanced microchips and machining tools to China in an effort to slow its development of advanced AI. China currently produces 7nm and 5nm chips domestically, but mostly using foreign equipment that it does not own and whose use could be revoked at any time. South Korea, for example, had to seek U.S. permission to continue production of microchips inside of China, or suffer the effect of secondary sanctions against it. At the moment, though, China does not have access to 3nm chips, the world's most advanced and critical to efforts to develop artificial intelligence. Only Taiwan is currently producing these chips, though President Biden has negotiated the expansion of Taiwan's manufacturing of those chips to mainland U.S. Taiwan was extremely reluctant to do so, because so far its ability to produce these chips at home has worked to both fend off the Chinese aggression and ensure U.S. defense. Seizing Taiwan's microchip production facilities is of paramount importance to China in case of invasion, and it's just as important to the United States that China not gain control of those facilities. With an iron grip on the production of the world's most advanced microchips, China would gain massive economic leverage over the entire world. Leverage that it could, and given its history would use, to coerce nations to behave how it wants them to, or to give in to Chinese demands. For the US, this isn't just an economic threat, but a threat to the entire rules-based liberal world order. It also threatens to cripple US efforts to build advanced new technologies while fueling Chinese development. Taiwan is important for a third reason, though, and this is far more practical. Today, the island nation sits right in the middle of what's called the First Island Chain. The FIC is a line drawn between Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines and represents the single greatest deterrent to Chinese aggression. With friendly nations making up the First Island Chain, the US and its allies can easily contain the Chinese Navy, and thus its military. Any attempt to deploy Chinese fleets out of the South China Sea in a time of war would see them under attack from multiple directions, and China's ability to utilize its submarine fleet would also be severely constrained by the defenses of the FIC. Currently, Chinese subs must run a gauntlet of underwater sensors, friendly air patrols, and allied submarines on the hunt, and it is very limited on just where China can move its submarines with any hope of remaining undetected. For the entirety of the Cold War and into the modern age, the First Island Chain has contained communist powers in Asia, while preventing them from projecting military power far from home. For this reason, taking Taiwan is of critical importance to the Chinese Communist Party, as it would allow them to effectively sever the First Island Chain. With a steep drop-off from Taiwan's east coast, which sits near the edge of the continental shelf into the depths of the Pacific, Chinese submarines could evade detection as they slip unseen into the Pacific. This places all American and Allied fleets and even land-based targets under threat thanks to an expanding fleet of ballistic missile submarines that can carry conventional cruise missiles. Of greatest concern, though, is the ability for China's nuclear-armed subs to patrol unseen and thus threaten a surprise nuclear strike against America or her allies. Can China really take Taiwan, though? And what will the US do if it does? Historically speaking, China's had no hope of taking Taiwan. During the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in the mid-1990s, the United States sailed a carrier strike group through the Taiwan Strait as a show of force. The Chinese military was utterly humiliated, knowing it could do nothing to counter the threat posed by even a single American strike group sailing just 24 miles off its own shore. The Chinese Communist Party vowed to never be humiliated again, and in the years after undertook a massive modernization and armament effort that's lasted to this day. Today, China officially controls the world's largest navy, though it still lags significantly behind the United States in sheer tonnage, at just over half the total tonnage of the US. In fact, China is not a blue water navy with the ability to deploy far from home shores. Its lack of aircraft carriers and naval aircraft, as well as marine expeditionary forces and support ships, make it impossible for China to threaten anywhere in the world that it's not already given free access to. But it doesn't really have to have a blue water navy to win in Taiwan, and it doesn't need to outweigh the US Navy either. A war for Taiwan would take place close to home for China, within easy reach of its large air force, which would make up for its abysmal lack of naval aviation. Those aircraft would also operate under the safety of both shore and sea-based air defenses, presenting an incredibly prickly problem for the US and its allies to deal with in a war over the skies of Taiwan. China's larger fleet of cruisers and smaller hulls would be well suited for the shallower waters of the Taiwan Strait itself, which would likely be entirely too dangerous for the US submarines to operate in. Shore-based anti-ship defenses also promise to make it almost impossible for the US to operate major surface platforms anywhere close to the Chinese coast for at least the first few months of the war, at least until China's supply of anti-ship missiles begins to run out. There is thus a very real possibility that China's smaller, nimbler navy is more than capable of defeating the US Navy in a battle for Taiwan. And that's without accounting for the fact that the United States is not able to bring the entirety of its naval forces into the fight in the first place. Global security commitments mean that the US can only supplement its Pacific Fleet with a limited number of ships and aviation from other global theaters. A lapse in US presence in the Middle East, for example, could encourage Iran to take action against Saudi Arabia or even Israel, potentially leading to a global crisis. The one area other than naval aviation that China's been lacking in for a successful invasion of Taiwan, though, is its amphibious assault capabilities. China has 72 older landing ships currently in service, along with 8 amphibious transport docks and 3 landing helicopter dock ships. It's expanding its fleet of amphibious assault ships with new modern designs, and by 2027 it's estimated to at last have the capacity to move large enough amounts of men, equipment, and supplies for a successful landing in Taiwan. A successful landing does not guarantee victory, but it does allow China to begin to seize airfields and ports that can then be used to grow its foothold on the island. China's rapid expansion of its military has put a ticking clock on the invasion of Taiwan, and many see it as an alarm clock and not a possibility. Taiwan is a silent humiliation for the CCP, which claims to be a global superpower and yet is unable to annex a breakaway island nation right off its own shore. With a population bomb already exploding and a massive decline down to 900 million expected, with subsequent economic fallout, China's ability to take Taiwan comes with an expiration date, and so does the CCP itself if it fails to resolve the Taiwan question. Currently, the United States is confident that it and its allies can defend Taiwan. But what if they fail? Already, America's insulating itself against the possibility of a fall of Taiwan. President Biden's negotiation to move 3-nanometer chip manufacturing to the U.S. ensures that America will continue to produce advanced microchips even if Taiwanese facilities are seized by the CCP or destroyed in the fighting. Further, President Biden has invested considerably into domestic efforts to produce microchips and the rare earth minerals that China currently has a stranglehold on in the global economy. This is making America resilient versus the effects of both war with China and a failure to defend Taiwan. The second biggest issue for the U.S. in a post-successful invasion of Taiwan is the matter of containment of Chinese forces. With the first island chain broken, the Chinese Navy would largely be free to project Chinese power globally and would significantly complicate future wars against China. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean makes it difficult to track Chinese submarines, though space-based assets can easily locate, identify, and track major surface action groups. Locating them, though, is different from destroying them, especially if Chinese naval expansion continues at breakneck speed, while the U.S. faces a significant shortage of critical materials for replenishment of advanced weapon systems. The U.S. is already creating what it's deemed a ghost fleet. The American Navy aims to create a large fleet of unmanned vessels, specifically made to counter China's expanding numbers and the possibility of the collapse of the first island chain. As of the making of this video, 2 unmanned ships are currently undergoing trials in the Pacific alongside manned ships, and the goal is to expand the Ghost Fleet to 100 or more vessels. These ships will do everything from anti-submarine warfare, reconnaissance, and even serve as mobile batteries full of missiles to supplement manned ships. The second island chain serves as a fallback position from which to contain the Chinese Navy. The chain stretches from Japan's Bonin Islands down to Guam and Western New Guinea. In the event of a Chinese victory in Taiwan, the United States, Japan, the Philippines, and Australia would look to bolster the defenses and resiliency of the second island chain. It's likely that an additional defensive chain currently proposed would be adopted, this time stretching from Lakshadweep to Diego Garcia and toward the Persian Gulf, from which Chinese oil trade could be threatened. The U.S. is already building a strong relationship with India, and this relationship will be strengthened further if Taiwan falls. While the U.S. and India have never been particularly close, this relationship has seen a dramatic shift in recent years. Historically, India has been far more closely aligned with Russia and the Soviet Union before it. However, the war in Ukraine drove a wedge in that relationship, helped by the revelation of how poorly Russian weapons were performing against even small amounts of Western arms. As a major buyer of Russian weapons, India's confidence was deeply shaken by the failure of Russian missiles, aircraft, and tanks. And as it looks toward its border with China that is rapidly modernizing and today outclasses India militarily, the nation switched allegiances and now looks to the United States for a new source of arms. In particular, the failure of the Su-57 program helped convince India that it needed to look elsewhere for the technology to counter China's increasingly sophisticated air force. India was originally a partner in the development of the Su-57, but pulled completely out of the program when it realized that the Su-57 would fall significantly short of the aircraft it was being designed to compete with, the F-22 Raptor. This dealt a crippling blow to Russia's ability to produce the Su-57, given its financial woes, and to date the nation has produced nothing more than a token force of mostly demonstration aircraft. The fall of Taiwan would hasten the warming of relations between the US and India, as it would place India in a very precarious situation. With the US and its allies no longer containing Chinese fleets, they would be free to enter the Straits of Malacca and the Indian Ocean beyond. This would place Chinese warships off the coast of India, a precarious situation for the two rivals. The fall of Taiwan, however, would present other major problems for India and the rest of Southeast Asia, as it would significantly diminish U.S. influence in the region. Without faith that America could deter Chinese aggression, let alone defend them in case of a war, many Southeast Asian nations would quickly fall in line with the Chinese Communist Party. Suddenly, India would find itself with China-aligned Pakistan on one flank, China to the north, and new Chinese partners on its eastern flank. Increasing partnerships between the Indian and American militaries aim to counter this threat, and the U.S. would invest heavily into improving its partnership. Currently, India is not set to ever host U.S. forces on its soil, but the fall of Taiwan and the collapse of its neighbors to Chinese influence could prompt wider Indian-American military cooperation that could see American forces being sent to India to help defend the nation and keep the Indian Ocean clear of Chinese fleets. Ultimately, the fall of Taiwan would threaten the entire global world order that's created the calmest stretch of time in all of human history. The best preparation that America and its allies can undertake for a fall of Taiwan is to ensure that it never falls in the first place. It's no secret that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not gone according to the Kremlin's plans. What looked like a landslide victory for the Russian military in the spring of 2022 has now become a meat grinder of a stalemate, reminiscent of the Western Front during World War I. While this war continues to rain down destruction on the local level, the war in Ukraine has far-reaching implications that go beyond Europe and onto the world stage as well. China has long been a partner of Russia, going as far back as the early days of the Cold War. Now China again finds itself embroiled together in another sort of proxy war with their old friend. China and Russia are inseparable, with many shared interests, resources, and possibly even destinies. If Russia's invasion of Ukraine were to flounder and go belly up, it would have several terrifying and dangerous implications for China. With Russia defeated, Putin overthrown, or a second Russian civil war kicking off, China's standing in the international community would be in jeopardy, and they would be left with an exposed flank. Let's dive in. Starting off with the most immediate consequence, the balance of world power. The fighting in Ukraine is, depending on who you get your news from, not going according to plan for the Kremlin. They assumed that they would roll over Ukraine in a matter of days, sweeping aside their small military and taking over key cities. That clearly did not happen. They forgot to take into account that the Ukrainian people are incredibly tough, resilient, and no strangers to foreign invaders. They'll defend their families and their homes to the last bullet. Another thing they did not count on is the good old American arms industry. American weapons and supplies, along with the rest of NATO, have kept the Ukrainian military as armed and as dangerous as possible. So yeah, it was a bit of a miscalculation. The Russian military has taken a few black eyes over the past 2 years and has barely completed any of the objectives it began with. Now let's just assume that the Ukrainians are able to achieve victory, or at the very least, mire the Russian military into a grinding, slow defeat. If something like this were to happen, it would shake Russia to its very core. You can only deceive people for so long before they see the truth of the situation. Vladimir Putin has bet the farm on this war, used it for all of his propaganda for his alleged re-election, and convinced at least some of the Russian public that the war is crucial. Some Russian holy men even went as far as to call this a holy war. Long story short, Russia simply cannot afford to lose this war, and neither can China. So what happens to China if Russia loses and/or collapses? From a strategic point of view, China would be very lonely on the world stage. The loss of Russia as a serious partner and deterrent to the West would shift the balance of power away from China. China would be left with Iran and North Korea as the top allies against the United States, Great Britain, and all of NATO. A situation like this is something that she is desperately trying to avoid. Chinese military planners have been studying the war in Ukraine as a classic example of what not to do and how to turn the entire world against you. It's almost certain that with the military failures we've seen in Ukraine, the Chinese military planners have gone back to the drawing board for their own plans. One of the main stressors is sure to be the scenario of what would happen if their arms trade with Russia was suddenly cut off. With how the Chinese handled the Tiananmen Square situation in 1989, China has been under an arms embargo and hasn't been able to buy or sell anything of military value to the West ever since. Consequently, China's relied heavily on Russia to procure arms and military supplies ever since, beginning with the acquisition of complete weapon systems and progressing to the building of an entire defense industry. China's also become a major military manufacturing hub for Russia. This newfound Chinese military-industrial complex has only accelerated under President Xi, who stresses Chinese self-sufficiency and seems likely to continue down that path. Their partnership with Russia continues to get deeper and deeper, bleeding into all sectors of the economy. This relationship has continued, and some would say accelerated, since the war in Ukraine began, with China circumventing worldwide sanctions against Russia. While China is not outright admitted to giving military help to Russia, it's not a huge leap of the imagination. A crippled or destroyed Russia would prove disastrous for the Chinese military-industrial complex and would result in an unimaginable loss in revenue. China might be able to sell the arms to other smaller countries, but nothing can replace the black hole for weapons that is the Russian military in Ukraine. Outside of the defense industry, China is one of the largest energy importers and consumers. Although it produces a lot of energy, oil, and gas, it needs to import a large amount to keep up with the demand of its growing economy. It's also the world leader in the production of electric vehicles, which require a lot of resources. On top of all that, China is the world leader in coal production and a major consumer of it as well. Because of this, China is constantly the worst emitter of greenhouse gases around the world. China accounted for about a quarter of the world's consumption in 2022. It consistently ranks in the top 3 consumers of oil, gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, wind, and solar power. Its overall energy consumption rate has been steadily increasing over the past decade. Its consumption continues to outpace its production, and this has turned China into a major importer, importing around 85% of the energy it consumes from abroad. China's importation of Russian oil and gas has only increased since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. This is due in part to their increasingly close partnership, but also due to the war in Ukraine and the sanctions and embargoes that followed. With the completion of the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline, ESPO, in 2011, Russia has been able to efficiently get its oil to consumers in Asia, especially China. In 2022, Russian oil exports to China grew by 16%, and Russia became the largest oil supplier to China. In addition to this, China has become one of the largest recipients of Russian gas. Before 2019, Russia supplied 3% of China's gas, but ever since the completion of another pipeline, the Power of Siberia 1, Russia has become China's 4th largest supplier, growing to 8.5% of their imports. That number has grown even further since then, with some estimates saying that since 2022, Chinese imports of Russian gas have increased by 50%. A larger pipeline is currently being built, and when completed, it'll only increase the trading partnership between the two nations and help Russia make up the ground they lost when their gas exports were shut out of Europe. If Russia were to fall or become destabilized, this could drastically affect every facet of the Chinese economy and its military. While the Chinese government is careful not to overly rely on one supplier, the amount of Russian oil and gas they use cannot be ignored. If the worst were to happen, China would have to replace that oil and gas to maintain the pace of growth. As international tensions between China and the West continue to grow, they may have to get a little creative to meet their demand. They could increase their reliance on Venezuela or Qatar to fill the gap. But if the supply cannot meet the demand, then this could become a bit of a sticky situation rather quickly. A Russian decline would only strengthen the West and give them more confidence in their advantages over the Chinese. In the global power struggle between East and West, both sides are always looking for an edge, something to knock the opponent down a peg. China suddenly finds itself feeling very lonely, or at the very least unsupported on its side of the table, and the West might do something bold to shake things up economically as well. Besides the obvious sanctions and tariffs that could be imposed, China has much bigger fears about the survival of its latest project. The Belt and Road Initiative is a massive infrastructure undertaking, often referred to as the New Silk Road. If you remember from history class, the Silk Road was the first of its kind. A series of trade networks connected East and West in a dazzling display of wealth and international cooperation. Cultures and religions mixed like never before, planting the seeds of globalization. For all their bloodlust and shocking levels of violence, the Mongols actually saw the value in the Silk Road and kept it going. President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 to increase Chinese influence around the world. The project seeks to link Asia with Africa, Oceania, Latin America, and Europe through a series of development and investment opportunities. I know what you're thinking. Is this just a way for China to expand its military around the globe? Maybe, and you aren't alone in thinking that. Many world leaders, including President Biden, are very skeptical of the true nature of this initiative. The initiative will create new railways, energy pipelines, highways, and border crossings. The goal is to connect former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan with Pakistan, India, and Southeast Asia. The overland connection would flood Asia with more Chinese currency than ever and boost economies across the continent. In addition to this, China has funded hundreds of economic zones and industrial areas in their own country that are supposed to create jobs and stimulate growth. The second part of this plan involves maritime trade and could see investment worldwide. China has agreed to invest in port development along the Indian Ocean, all over Southeast Asia, East Africa, and parts of Europe. The reach of the project is impressive. So far, 147 countries have agreed to be a part of the initiative or are interested. Those countries cover about 2/3 of the world's population and 40% of the global GDP. China has already contributed a staggering amount of money to the project, totaling around $1 trillion. The total expenses are projected to be around $8 trillion. The largest section of the initiative so far is the China-Pakistan Corridor, or CPEC, which has cost around $62 billion. The goal of CPEC is to connect China to Pakistan's Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea. Ambitious doesn't even come close to covering the immensity of this whole thing. China desperately wants to grow its economic influence worldwide, develop new trade routes, grow its export markets, and boost Chinese incomes. While China's motivations seem clear on the surface, many are wary of their true intentions. One of the key issues Western countries have with this initiative is that the Chinese can exert geopolitical influence on those smaller countries or bind them into contracts that solely benefit the Chinese. In some cases, China retains the right to demand loan repayment anytime. This gives China the ability to strong-arm smaller countries into being on the Chinese side of things on issues such as Taiwan or their treatment of the Uyghurs. For this project and the interests of the Chinese abroad, they need the scales of power to stay where they are. They have far too much to lose. Time will tell how this incredibly ambitious project pans out. But another major source of fear for the Chinese is the backlash they might receive when it comes to the Uyghurs or Taiwan. If there suddenly was a massive shift in global power to the West, the CCP would be in trouble for the way it's treated the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are a Muslim minority ethnic group that lives primarily in northwestern China. In recent years, the CCP has come under tremendous scrutiny for its alleged persecution of this group. Beginning in 2014, the CCP and President Xi authorized the incarceration of around 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps. This was done with no legal process, and it is the largest scale detention of a minority group since the Second World War. Take a second to think about that one. Once in these camps, the Uyghurs were subjected to forced labor, suppression of their religion, political brainwashing, forced sterilization, and even forced abortions. Many of their mosques were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of children were taken away from their parents and shipped to boarding schools where even more horrors awaited them. By 2019, the camps had started to be phased out, and the Uyghurs were sent to more traditional penitentiaries. but who knows if their living conditions improved. The whole situation is deplorable and a clear violation of every basic human right. China does not want more attention on this or any Western interference that could occur if China suddenly found itself on its back foot. The same goes for Taiwan. Unless you've been hiding under a rock since the late 1940s, you should know that China is very eager to bring Taiwan back into the fold. China wants to take it back with as little fuss as possible. But unfortunately for them, Taiwan doesn't want that, and they have a lot of firepower backing them up. Seeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine flounder the way it has surely has pushed back any Chinese plans to take Taiwan by force. Now on paper, the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, is just as impressive and well-armed as its Russian counterpart. It has state-of-the-art weapon systems and enough manpower to intimidate anyone. Will it all come together and push through to victory? It's hard to say. The PLA has not been involved in a serious war since 1979. They participated in a UN peacekeeping mission in Africa in 2016, but very few PLA soldiers were involved in that. I'm sure the PLA would love to forget about it too, as it was a disaster for them. Any officers with actual combat experience are well into their 50s, if not their 60s. The PLA's lack of hands-on field experience is a major cause for concern. That would be like getting ready for a football game, but only one guy has actually played against an actual opponent. In addition to their lack of experience, they also have not tested their weapon systems in real combat, at least not to any serious degree. I'm sure they've passed every benchmark on the range, but that can only get you so far. Look at their main assault rifle, the QBZ-95. It's great on the range, but will it deliver on the battlefield? There might be a bit of a learning curve once the bullets start flying. Even from a tactical level, the invasion plans might require some rethinking. Amphibious invasions, which are the most likely course for the PLA to take, are challenging. Weather and surprise play large factors in the success of those operations, and both seem unlikely to favor the PLA. The Taiwanese defense is outfitted with state-of-the-art radar systems, as well as some assistance from the US government's satellites and drones. If everything is operational, they'll see any invasion coming from a long way off. The only real chance the PLA has here is a coordinated strike with cyber attacks that blind Taiwan and the US radar and reconnaissance devices. As if that wasn't enough, the weather in the Taiwan Strait can be unpredictable and volatile at times. The area can experience typhoons, dense fog, high winds, tropical storms, waves up to 20 feet high, and even 2 different monsoon seasons. An amphibious invasion is a logistical nightmare all on its own, even before you add in inclement weather. If PLA troops were able to make it ashore, they would face a fortress of defensive works. The Taiwanese have spent the last few decades rearming and preparing to defend their island against what seems like an inevitable invasion. They built defensive fortifications and tunnels into the rugged topography of the island to move troops and supplies to various positions without exposing them to enemy fire. In addition to this, the Taiwanese soldiers are planning to use a strategy that's been leveling the playing field in Ukraine, that of asymmetrical weapon systems. Weapons like the Javelin or Stinger missile systems can be extremely effective and can level the playing field for smaller armies facing much larger ones. These portable weapons can maximize your advantages, like stealth and speed, while minimizing the enemy's armor and numerical advantage. So even if the invading forces are able to put boots on the ground, they'll face a tremendous challenge once they begin inland. They'll face a determined enemy with well-supplied, well-prepared defenses who have been waiting for this day for a very long time. Another major roadblock to Chinese ambition is the United States' bases and forces, which are always within striking distance of Taiwan. The United States military has several bases around Taiwan in countries such as the Philippines and Japan. In 2014, the U.S. signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, with the Philippine government, which allowed the U.S. to build 9 military bases, rotate troops through the country, and train local forces. Japan has a similar agreement, and the U.S. has about 20 bases currently in the country. More recently, U.S. Special Forces units have been rotating through some of the small islands surrounding Taiwan. Much to Chinese annoyance, this move is seen as a further provocation of an already unfriendly situation. In addition to supplies and advice, the U.S. and Taiwan have defense agreements in place that would see the U.S. theoretically help defend the island. The wording of the agreement is somewhat vague, but it's clear enough that the Chinese will get the picture. Attack Taiwan and the situation becomes an international crisis between 2 nuclear superpowers very quickly. The situation is fragile, to say the least. The high-level planners in the PLA and the CCP are very cautious about how to proceed. They've seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine and are trying to learn from their mistakes. They don't want to overextend themselves and get drawn into a war of attrition like the Russians have. A prolonged conflict is exactly what the CCP wants to avoid. COVID was a trying time for China. Its people were oppressed, their freedom and civil liberties were systematically stripped from them, and things became more and more like 1984 every day. Unrest and outbursts of protests were common during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a potentially unpopular war was one thing the CCP did not want. It wouldn't be the first time a war took a turn for the worst and caused the citizens to rise up and overthrow the government. That possibility alone is giving the CCP pause as it considers the next steps when it comes to Taiwan. The last thing that Xi and the CCP want is to emerge weaker and more isolated from a botched invasion of Taiwan. Now, you can guarantee that any invasion in the near future will be as well prepared as humanly possible to avoid a pitfall similar to Ukraine, but the outcome is far from certain. All in all, the war in Ukraine has rippled across the world and it's impacting the actions and policies of many countries. One of the countries that's watching the action the closest is China. They are deeply embedded with the Russians both militarily and economically. Their trading of arms and energy is critical to the growth and future of both nations. The last thing China wants is for there to be a shift in global power that leaves the United States and the West in a position to go after China. On the surface, the war in Ukraine looks like it's a fight between Ukraine and Russia, but in reality, it's the pinnacle of a global power struggle that threatens to derail the fate of many nations. Time will tell. Through the years, numerous Chinese leaders have worked toward turning China into a more powerful military force. However, no leader has been as ambitious in this endeavor as Xi Jinping, the current president of the People's Republic of China. Shortly after taking office, Xi started promoting the so-called Chinese Dream, which he labeled as the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This rejuvenation is to take place by 2049, the country's centenary, and seeks to turn China into a modern and capable world-class military powerhouse. But how is this plan unfolding some 25 years before its scheduled completion? In other words, how does China's military rank among the top global powers in 2024? If you're looking for a short answer, it ranks high. In fact, the U.S. Department of Defense sees the People's Republic of China as the only competitor to the United States on the global stage. That's why the department prepares an annual report titled Military and Security Developments Involving the People's Republic of China. This report provides in-depth insights into China's military advancements and their implications for global security. The latest of these reports makes one thing clear: China has all the intent and increasingly the capacity to reshape the international order. In this video, we'll focus on the capacity in question, breaking down China's military capabilities in 2024. Of course, this breakdown will primarily be based on the report curated by the U.S. Department of Defense. However, it'll also consult the 2024 Global Firepower Report, which ranks China third out of 145 examined countries in terms of military power. This report takes a unique, by-the-numbers approach to assessing military strength, considering factors such as manpower, financial resources, and logistical capabilities. But whichever report you consult, you'll come to the same conclusion: China is a formidable military power that is just getting started. Of course, to make these ambitious military dreams a reality, the country needs one thing the most: money. So let's start with China's military budget. At the moment, China is the second biggest spender on defense globally, trailing only behind the US. However, even the word trailing might be an understatement, given the discrepancy in the defense budgets of the two countries. As the #1 military spender in the world, the US plans to allocate a mind-boggling $886 billion to national defense in 2024. For China, on the other hand, this figure is closer to $236 billion. But there's more to this discrepancy than meets the eye. Sure, China might have a significantly lower military budget in 2024 compared to the US, but not compared to China in 2023. You see, China's 2024 military budget marks a hefty 7.2% rise in military spending in a single year, building on over 20 years of defense upgrades. In contrast, the US military's budget is capped at a 1% increase, all thanks to a 2023 budget deal. Since no similar cap exists in China, and the country seems to be drastically increasing its military budget every single year, it's easy to see why the US deems it the biggest and most worrying competitor in terms of military strength. Of course, the fact that China has a substantially larger military in terms of manpower certainly does not help. But in this regard, China doesn't just trump the US, it trumps every other country in the world. That's right, China has the largest standing army in the world, with over 3 million personnel committed to various degrees and across different branches of service. However, to be fair, this is probably expected from one of the most populous countries in the world. As of 2024, China has 1.42 billion people, making up 17.72% of the total world population. It's closely edged out in battle for the coveted title of the most populous country by India, which only has some 3 million people more. These staggering figures also give China and India the biggest pool of potential military recruits, providing them with a significant advantage in terms of military power from the get-go. So theoretically, China can commit as many as 763 million people to its war efforts, a figure that dwarfs the entire population of many countries, the US included. Of course, not all of these available individuals could be mobilized for military purposes, as many factors including health and social needs come into play. But even if we only consider the total population fit for military service, China still reigns supreme. According to estimations, the country could mobilize as many as 626 million of its inhabitants, about 82% of all available individuals. To understand just how massive this figure is, all you need to know is that the US could do the same with nearly 124 million people. Talk about a numerical advantage. If you believe this gap will close anytime soon, we've got bad news. China ranks second among global countries in terms of the total available population reaching military age annually. At this point of time, China is expected to gain some 20 million new potential recruits every year. The US, in contrast, can expect roughly 4 times less. The same goes for every other country in the world, except the first-ranked India, as no one's able to surpass the 5 million threshold of new recruits. But enough with the future. Let's see how China currently stands in terms of military manpower. To do so, we'll look into 3 key aspects: active military personnel, reserve personnel, and paramilitary forces. Active duty personnel are arguably the most critical components, as these individuals are the ones immediately available for deployment in case of conflicts or emergencies anywhere in the world. China has over 2 million of these personnel, making it the largest active duty military force by a margin. The second and third ranked countries, India and the US, have 1.45 and 1.32 million respectively. China's active duty personnel also make up roughly 60% of all available manpower in the country. This means that in the event of a war, the country would have a substantial force ready for immediate action, allowing for victory through sheer strength of numbers. With such a huge number of active military personnel, who needs a large reserve? Not China, that's for sure. That's why the country only has about 500,000 reservists at its disposal. Of course, we use the word "only" quite loosely here. After all, this figure still puts China in the top 15 countries in the world. The only reason this number might seem small is because the first-ranked country, Vietnam, boasts a staggering 5 million reservists. But let's not forget, Vietnam has a long history of conflict that has shaped the country's approach to national defense. In other words, Vietnam has no global ambitions similar to those of China. It just wants to ensure its security and defend its sovereignty. China, on the other hand, is a much larger and developed country with an entirely different approach to military size and strategy. The country sees reserve duty officers and soldiers as more of a support system for active duty personnel. As for their secondary mission, reservists are there to help maintain social order and provide aid during national disasters. Interestingly, these are also some of China's paramilitary forces roles. As of 2024, China officially has about 625,000 paramilitary personnel. However, it's important to note that the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, reserves are often considered a paramilitary unit, which would significantly boost this number. That's not to mention all male citizens are required to enroll in the militia as soon as they turn 18, as per China's military service law. But what exactly do these paramilitary forces do? The militia can be mobilized for various peacetime and wartime missions. During peacetime, militia units will provide humanitarian aid and disaster relief, support military training, and help maintain internal security. It's all about what these units can do for the active duty PLA personnel in wartime. The militia soldiers will assist these personnel and even replace them if necessary. However, depending on the circumstances, the militia can also be deployed on independent security operations. This just leaves us with one more crucial paramilitary component, the People's Armed Police, or PAP. During peacetime, The PAP's primary mission is to take care of internal and maritime security, riot control, and counter-terrorism operations. In times of war, as you can probably guess, the PAP is there to support the PLA. All in all, the total number of China's military and paramilitary personnel is nothing short of impressive. These astounding figures also correspond to one of the tenets of active defense, the military strategy China uses to safeguard its sovereignty, security, and development interests. This tenet states, "Soldiers and the people are the source of victory." Now, no one can deny that there is strength in numbers, but let's be honest, numbers would hardly matter if it weren't for military equipment, weaponry, and technology. So let's see how China ranks in these regards. Here we have 4 areas of interest: China's land power, air power, naval force, and nuclear capabilities. But before diving into each one of these categories, you should first get to know the forces using them. In other words, it's time to look into the major service branches under the People's Liberation Army banner. In total, there are 5 of these branches: the People's Liberation Army Ground Force, or PLA-GF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, or PLA-AF, the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF, and the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, or PLASSF. Let's start on the ground. Sure, the PLA-GF has steadily reduced active duty personnel in the last 3 decades. However, this branch still outnumbers other military branches by a margin. It accounts for roughly 1 million of China's total active military personnel. As for the People's Liberation Army Air Force, this branch has grown steadily since 2015, indicating its increasing importance. In 2024, the PLA-AF has approximately 400,000 personnel. Add the PLA's Naval Air Force into the mix, and you have the largest aviation force in the Indo-Pacific region. But of course, China's ambitions span well beyond this region, and that's why it shouldn't be surprising that the PLAAF continues to rapidly catch up to the Western Air Forces. This branch has also shifted focus from territorial air defense to building a force capable of projecting air power at long range, another testament to the country's global ambitions. These ambitions can also explain why China has one of the largest military fleets in the world, both in terms of active duty personnel and vessels. As you'll soon see, the People's Liberation Army Navy is about 300,000 strong. This just leaves us with 2 more branches, both somewhat unique in their nature and foreign to the Western military's planners. The first is the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, which manages the country's land-based missile units, both nuclear and conventional. This branch has about 120,000 personnel. As for the last, the smallest, and the newest branch of the People's Liberation Army, Strategic Support Force, it centralizes China's cyber, electronic, and space warfare capabilities. In other words, this is the force behind China's infamous information warfare, a beloved weapon in the country's gray zone warfare arsenal. And that's it, the 5 branches of the People's Liberation Army and their sizes and roles. Now let's see what kind of technology they have at their disposal. Though we'll look into forces separately and individually, it's important to remember that China's goal is to conduct the full range of operations all at once. However, our goal is much simpler, helping you to understand how strong China is across various warfare domains. So let's take it step by step. As always, we'll start at the ground level and work our way up and around. When it comes to land power, China has historically relied on the Soviet Union and later Russia as its primary material supplier. However, the country has been slowly turning away from Russia, opting to work with other European countries like France or rely on local solutions when building new equipment. As of 2024, China boasts a sizable land force consisting of roughly 200,000 armored and unarmored vehicles. This impressive figure places China among the top 4 land forces in the world. But let's take a closer look at the composition of the force. First up, the strongest fleet in terms of numbers is the Armored Fighting Vehicles fleet. In this department, China ranks at number 2, with about 174,300 of these vehicles. The only country that has more fighting vehicles than China is the US, which has more than double the number of these vehicles. The most represented among these vehicles are the following models. Number 1, the ZBL-08, with over 2,000 units. Though the PLA-GF primarily operates this 8-wheel vehicle as an armored personnel carrier, or APC, or an infantry fighting vehicle, IFV, the ZBL-08 is increasingly used in reconnaissance and anti-aircraft operations. Number 2, the ZBD-04A, with 1,925 units. This medium-armored tracked IFV seats 7 combat-ready troops and is widely used by the PLA-GF. Number 3. The WZ-501, also known as the Type 86A, is available in 1,250 units to the PLA-GF. This vehicle is nothing more than a copy of a Soviet-era BMP-1 IFV, which is no longer in production. The next notable land fleet is China's Tank Brigade. China has roughly 5,000 tanks, which ranks it above the US, and it operates about 4,600 of these vehicles. Of course, neither China nor the US can compete with Russia in this regard, as the country owns a massive fleet of almost 15,000 tanks. Among China's tank fleet, some vehicles are considered the primary main battle tanks, or MBTs, of the country's land forces. The most represented among them are the 2,500 units of the ZTZ-96 Soviet-inspired tanks that are armed with 125mm smoothbore guns, the 635 units of the ZTZ-99 ultra-modern tanks that are armed with 125mm smoothbore guns, the 625 units of the ZTZ-99A tanks that had a more powerful engine and a better main gun armament. Next in China's land force fleet, self-propelled and towed artillery systems. These vehicles primarily serve to provide fire support to ground troops, engage enemy positions, and destroy enemy fortifications and vehicles. The only difference between the two systems is pretty obvious from their names alone. The former vehicles can move independently on the battlefield, while the latter must be towed behind other vehicles. Judging by the numbers, China relies significantly more on the former type. China's land force fleet has approximately 3,850 self-propelled gun vehicles, or SPGs. This figure places it third place globally behind Russia and North Korea, but ahead of the US, which has about 1,500 of these systems. As for their towed counterparts, China still ranks ahead of the US with 1,434 units, but this number places it at the number 13 spot globally. Unsurprisingly, the number 1 spot is reserved for Russia, which boasts over 8,000 towed artillery pieces. The last fleet worth looking into, especially considering China's military branches, is the Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS fleet. Given that the country has a separate branch dedicated to rocket forces, it should not be surprising that China places at the top of this category. All in all, it has about 3,180 of these so-called rocket projectors, leaving the US with not even 700 in the dust. However, this scenario isn't likely to repeat in any of the categories of the next force we're inspecting, China's air power. Why? Because the US maintains the strongest air force in the world by an impressive margin. To understand just how impressive we're talking, all you need to know is that China and Russia's aerial fleets together can't come close to the US's magnificent 13,000 aircraft strong fleet. Russia has a little over 4,000 aircraft, while China comes in third with about 3,300. Most of China's initial aircraft were modeled after Soviet units or even built under license with specific Soviet models and then renamed. However, over the years, China started replacing these aging aircraft with better and more capable types. So today, 3 aircraft are increasingly at the core of Chinese air power. Number 1. The Chengdu J-10 Vigorous Dragon, also known as the Firebird. This locally developed multi-role aircraft currently serves as the backbone of China's air operations, accounting for almost 600 units. Number 2. The Shenyang J-11, the Soviet-inspired twin-engine jet fighter. Currently, the PLAAF owns over 200 of these aircraft types. Number 3. The Chengdu J-20, which is reportedly China's answer to the American F-22 Raptor. This 5th-generation fighter is incredibly stealthy, though not yet proven in active war zones. The PLAAF plans to produce over 200 units while owning about 115. These fighter aircraft are excellent indicators of China's aerial ambitions. Though it started with an outdated copy-and-paste fleet, China has made significant strides in developing its own indigenous fighter aircraft. And if we go by the numbers, this is the primary project of the PLAAF, as fighter jets make up as much as 36% of all of China's military aircraft. Here's a stat to put this figure into perspective. Only 14% of the US Air Force's aircraft are fighter aircraft. But this time, China's strength isn't only in the numbers. The country is also working on upgrading its existing fleet to meet the goal of a world-class military powerhouse through air superiority. Here are just some of the more recent upgrades. The Chengdu J-20 fighter received a new 2-seat variant in 2021. This model will also receive further upgrades, including more air-to-air missiles and supercruise capability. The latter is thanks to China's new and powerful engine, the WS-15s. Also, the Chengdu J-10C is likely to become a stealth fighter, as China is developing tech to make it undetectable in the skies. While we're on the topic of fighter aircraft, we must also mention China's attack aircraft fleet. This fleet is made up of some 370 aircraft, putting China in third place behind the US and Russia. The bulk of China's bomber fleet comprises H-6 Badger variants, which are just domestically produced Soviet Tupolev Tu-16 or Badger bombers. Other notable aircraft in China's aerial fleet include roughly 400 training aircraft to cover airmen's basic and advanced fighters, attack fighters, helicopters, and general flight training. Almost 300 transport aircraft transporting troops, equipment, and supplies. A little over 100 special mission aircraft designed to perform specialized tasks such as reconnaissance, surveillance, and electronic warfare. 10 tanker aircraft for aerial refueling operations. These aircraft are exceptionally expensive to make and challenging to use. This is why only the US boasts a significant fleet of them, with over 600. We must also mention China's helicopter fleet, which has recently seen an upgrade in the form of a new engine. China showcased this powerful 1,100 kilowatt turboshaft helicopter engine in 2023. In the future, the country plans to use this engine to revolutionize the development of medium and heavyweight helicopters. But for now, China operates a little over 900 helicopters, roughly 280 of which are dedicated attack helicopters. With this, we complete the overview of China's traditional aerial military equipment. But there is one more aspect worth mentioning: China's advancements in drone technology. Sure, these unmanned aerial systems, or UASs, are often not included in the total number of aerial equipment a country possesses. However, their importance in the modern age can't be understated. It seems that China is well aware of this importance as it keeps expanding the applications of UASs. Recently, the country has demonstrated its effectiveness in roles like disaster communications, firefighting, and weather modification. However, China is also increasingly focusing on the military capabilities of these drones, seeking to develop units that can engage in air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. But until these units join China's military equipment list, let's focus on what's currently there, this time in the naval power department. As mentioned, China is a formidable naval force, no matter which point of view you adopt, the number of mariners or the number of hulls. Since we've already tackled naval manpower, let's dive into China's naval fleet. It's no secret China has long worked to modernize its military equipment, and the country's warships are very much a part of those efforts. However, these warships might be the area of the country's heaviest investments. Why? The answer is simple. China doesn't really have the friendliest maritime neighbors. Though, to be fair, this is mostly China's own doing, as the nation has been asserting territorial claims left and right. Naturally, this has led to tensions with surrounding countries like Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The tensions in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the Taiwan Strait, mostly explain China's impressive warship fleet, which consists of 730 vessels. Only Russia has more, about 780. The core strength of China's naval power currently comes from its submarine and destroyer force, backed by numerous frigates and corvettes. So, let's round up these vessels first. As of 2024, the PLAN operates 60 submarines, which places them in proximity of the top two nations, 64 by the US and 65 by Russia. However, China has seemingly decided to focus on modernizing its existing submarine force rather than expanding its numbers significantly. That is, at least for now. By 2035, the PLAN plans to grow its submarine force to 80 units, which will be made possible by an expansion of the country's construction capacity. The current submarine fleet consists of the following vessel types: 6 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines (SSBN), 6 nuclear-powered attack submarines (SSN), 48 diesel-powered and air-independent powered attack submarines (SS). Next up, China's destroyer force. This force is almost 50 ships strong, ranking China second globally. Here's a quick breakdown of the vessels in this fleet. 29 Luoyang III-class warships commissioned since 2014. 8 Renhai-class hulls, a new warship class that began commissioned service in 2020. 6 Luoyang II-class destroyers commissioned in 2004. When it comes to frigates and corvettes, China is an undisputed leader in the world. But there is a reason for this. You see, China has a quite long coastline that has historically required a larger number of warships to patrol and secure. Since frigates and corvettes are smaller and generally less expensive than destroyers and submarines, these vessels were entrusted with this crucial task. So now China has 42 frigates and 72 corvettes. But it isn't stopping there. Instead, it's building bigger and more advanced vessels. The country's next-generation frigate, the Type 54B, was launched toward the end of 2023. This vessel boasts a more advanced radar with better detection capability, an integrated electronic propulsion system, or IEP, and a combined diesel and gas-powered system that makes it more challenging to detect. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that this frigate type has been labeled as a mini-destroyer by Chinese military experts. In the corvette department, things are seemingly even more exciting for China. An intriguing futuristic stealth corvette was spotted at Liaonan shipyard in 2023, prompting numerous questions about the future of the PLAN's naval designs. The only area China is currently severely lacking is aircraft carriers. Though these carriers are undoubtedly the flagship of a powerful navy, China has only 2 operational ones. Though to be fair, the US is the only country with a double-digit number of carriers, with 11. But again, China isn't just sitting idly by. Instead, it has recently launched a 3rd aircraft carrier and announced the construction of the 4th. China's 3rd aircraft carrier is also the country's first Type 3 class vessel. This carrier can displace upwards of 80,000 tons, making it the prized possession of the PLAN. Both of the previous aircraft carriers are Kuznetsov-class vessels, which are older and have faced various operational issues. With land, aerial, and naval power out of the way, we only have one more area of China's military force to cover: its nuclear capabilities. If there was a single word to describe China's nuclear arsenal, it would be burgeoning. China persists in rapidly modernizing, diversifying, and expanding its nuclear forces. A mere decade ago, these efforts were almost nowhere to be found, once again confirming how serious the country is about strengthening its overall military capabilities. As of 2024, China possesses over 500 operational nuclear warheads. By 2030, this number will likely double, as predicted by the US Department of Defense experts. By these numbers alone, and the nature of these weapons, it's clear that China is hell-bent on playing a crucial role in global affairs. If China's current military operations are an indicator of its future intentions, this might not be such good news for the rest of the world. Namely, China is increasingly conducting complex operations beyond the country's continental borders. Within Asia, China regularly ventures into the far reaches of the South China Sea, enforcing its territorial claims. But even beyond Asia, many foreign militaries now have to regularly encounter the PLA on the ground and at sea. Sometimes these encounters are military exercises and friendly contacts, but other times they are quite tense conflicts. Many of these conflicts are caused by China's persistent desire to overturn the international rules-based order. Of course, this is mostly done covertly and through gray zone tactics. On the surface, China tries to project an image of a responsible global player, constantly attempting to improve the global perceptions of its actions. For instance, Beijing has publicly denied providing lethal assistance to Russia during the Russo-Ukrainian War, despite there being evidence suggesting otherwise. Of course, more people are concerned with what China does than what it says it does. And what China has done is build a military that's more powerful and capable than ever, and seemingly on the rise. However, China's armed forces are yet to be tested in a major military conflict. And if Russia's disastrous invasion of Ukraine is any indicator, military hardware and manpower doesn't necessarily translate to victory in the conflict. So, what do you think? Does China really have what it takes to become the world-class military power it strives to be? Imagine the worst-case scenario. Years of simmering tensions come to a boil, leading to the United States entering a full-blown war with China. Of course, the rest of the world has to get involved. These are two powerhouses with massive geopolitical influence locking swords, leading to war engulfing the globe, and China is losing. Despite its massive military modernization program, China and its allies can't compete with the combined forces of the US and the many other countries that want to limit China's hold over the world. Beijing gets desperate, but it has an ace up its sleeve, a stockpile of over 410 nuclear weapons, according to the Arms Control Association, that it can launch at any time. Staring defeat in the face, China has to consider the unthinkable, launching a nuclear weapon. But what would that nuclear launch look like? Before we can answer that question, there is just one thing standing in Beijing's way. For decades, China has operated a no first use or NFU policy that says it will only use its stockpile of nukes if another country were to use theirs on it first. As recently as August 2023, the country's Director General of the Department of Arms Control, Sun Xiaobo, affirmed this policy created in 1964. that states that China commits not to be the first to use nuclear weapons at any time and under any circumstances. That would make it seem like the only time China would use nukes was if another country got desperate enough to launch against it. But the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, revealed some startling information in October 2023. China's NFU policy may be no more. In a document outlining its plans for creating a new global order, the Proposal of the People's Republic of China on the Reform and Development of Global Governance, all mentions of Beijing's NFU policy were strangely absent. This was a first for China. Every similar policy it has produced made sure to mention the NFU, likely as much for propaganda purposes as anything else. And given the great detail that Beijing went into for every other aspect of the policy, it's unlikely that the NFU omission was an oversight. This was a statement of intent. While China used the proposal to demand that the entire international community oppose the threat nuclear weapons present, it failed to do so itself. And with the Pentagon reporting that China has ramped up its nuclear weapon program, it's anticipated Beijing will have 1,500 nukes by 2035. That can only mean one thing. If China feels threatened enough, it may launch a nuclear attack without any nuclear provocation. That brings us back to our hypothetical situation of China losing a conventional war to the United States. No longer tethered by its NFU policy, the country decides that the nuclear option is the only option and prepares to launch. But first, it has to get into a position to do so, 3 weeks before China's nuclear launch. The decision to launch has not yet been officially made, but China has to prepare. According to the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, China has traditionally stored its nuclear warheads in different locations from the missiles used to launch them, only bringing the two together when it's prepared to conduct a strike. Now is that time. President Xi Jinping relays the order: arm the submarines and prepare our warheads, 2 weeks before China's nuclear launch. With warheads and missiles stored together, Jinping's attention turns to positioning. He's actively engaged in war with the United States, and he has to be clever to ensure as many of his nuclear deployment options are available when it's time to strike. China's first action will be to mobilize its DF-41 ICBM. With an effective range of between 7,500 and about 9,300 miles, the DF-41 is one of the most powerful missiles in the world. According to Missile Threat, it has a 5,500-pound payload and is capable of holding up to 10 nuclear warheads, more than enough to devastate any location Beijing targets. With such a massive range, China could easily launch nukes from its mainland to hit the outer reaches of the United States. Hawaii would be an obvious target, with distance calculator reporting it's just 5,939 miles from the most eastern point of China. That's well within the DF-41's range. But Hawaii would not likely be the only target. China could easily hit huge swaths of the continental US with launches from its mainland. But it gets worse. The DF-41 may be mobile. In 2015, China conducted tests on a rail-mobile version of the DF-41, meaning they have the ability to move the ICBM to almost any location that's connected to the country via rail. In the event of a global war, it's not outside the realms of possibility that China would take territory to its east or even align with the African nations to the west under the authority of the Belt and Road Initiative, giving it plenty of options for moving the DF-41 closer to its target. Combine that with the silo-based versions of the missile. China is believed to have silos in Gansu, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, and you have an obvious first step for China. Prepare the DF-41s for launch. But that's a step that wouldn't go unnoticed. Increased activity at existing silos or the transportation of these ICBMs to more convenient locations would likely prompt the US to swiftly track those targets, making sure they're kept on their radars at all time. Beijing would know this, and that's why the command to prepare the DF-41 systems would be met with a similar one to prepare its submarines. At that same time as Beijing prepares to launch an ICBM, it would likely send out its fleet of 6 Type 94 ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs, each of which would assume a tactical position underwater to conduct a launch against the United States if an ICBM launch fails. Alternatively, China might use its DF-41s as a diversionary tactic, taking America's focus off the deep waters while Beijing moves its Type 94 subs into position. Each of those submarines can carry 12 of China's JL-2 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, which according to Missile Threat reports have a maximum range of 4,970 miles. China likely wouldn't want to push its SLBMs to their maximum range, meaning the subs would have to take up positions south of Japan to enable an attack on Hawaii Or if Beijing's feeling especially confident, it could move the subs to the shores of Hawaii to enable a strike against the US mainland. Every JL-2 missile, remember there are 12 on each sub, can be armed with a 1 megaton nuclear warhead that the Korea Times said would be 67 times more powerful as the one that the US dropped on Hiroshima. Alternatively, China could arm each JL-2 with up to 8 multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, giving it the ability to strike multiple targets with smaller bombs if it wanted to go for a scattershot approach. Still, those subs have a limited range. Odds are that they would only be able to get into striking distance of America's northeast, but that would be more than enough for a launch, especially when combined with the DF-41's long-range capabilities. Nevertheless, the US would be on the lookout for China's Type 94 submarines, even with DF-41 movements being a potential diversion, meaning Beijing would have to do everything possible to protect their subs as they move into position. Enter the Xi'an H-6. It's believed that the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, has access to up to 231 H-6 bombers, with variants available for maritime battles and nuclear bombing. The latter can carry air-launched ballistic missiles, with Military Today pointing to the CHAS X-13 as the most likely candidate. With its 1,864-mile maximum range combined with the H-6's 3,728-mile flight range, China could just about get these bombers close enough to the US to launch a nuke, though the bomber would be practically dropping out of the sky by the time it did. More likely is that it would deploy its H-6s to defend its submarines. Armed with an array of anti-ship missiles, those planes would be on destroyer duty. Their task would be to take out any destroyers, which are armed with radar, depth charges, and torpedoes, to clear a path for China's 6 Type 94 subs to get into position. Chief amongst those missiles would be the YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missile. With its maximum range of 248 miles, each missile can reach Mach 3 and can be equipped with both nuclear and conventional warheads, weighing up to 1,100 pounds. Each is capable of evasive maneuvers in the air, too, meaning they can be launched from outside a destroyer's striking distance and make their way around any anti-air defenses a ship might have. The United States calls it the most dangerous anti-ship missile that China has at its disposal, and Beijing would definitely employ it to take out the ships that would target its nuclear submarines. With the orders in place, China would have its nuclear weapons in position. Subs would be stationed as close to America's west coast as China dares, and some, though likely not at all, if its DF-41s would be ready to launch. All the while, China's Navy would be cooperating with its Air Force to keep its subs safe, all ready for an eventual launch. 2 weeks of preparation sees China get its equipment into place. Finally, China reaches the day of the launch, 24 hours before China's nuclear launch. In the 24 hours before the launch, China's President Xi Jinping will be on high alert. He won't have slept. He'll know that what he intends to do will break every policy that China had so steadfastly held in the years leading up to the war. The removal of its NFU statements from its October 2023 policy report will be little solace as he watches and waits. Perhaps he won't have to launch. Maybe the tide of war will start to turn in China's favor, or the US will propose a ceasefire. China might win back territory it has lost, allowing Jinping to refocus on conventional fighting. But no positive news comes in. Jinping's generals all agree China is losing this war. If only it were fighting the United States one-on-one, the story could be different, but it isn't. Depleted by its war in Ukraine, Russia isn't as strong an ally as China had hoped it would be. NATO is buffeting all Chinese attempts to establish a foothold in Europe. Japan, though one of the primary targets of China's aggression, is holding steady with the aid of the Americans and South Korea. And even North Korea has proven not to be an effective ally. It's too focused on South Korea, which would enter the war as soon as China called on North Korea for aid, to do much to help China. 52 minutes before China's nuclear launch. Little is known about China's nuclear launch protocols. What we do know comes from the Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS. In 2004, the UCS received and translated a Chinese military text that suggested either the Central Military Commission or its chair, Xi Jinping, have the authority to launch a nuclear weapon. All 11 members of this commission are senior party officials or military generals, each of whom will have their own opinions on whether or not China should launch. Beyond that, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, says that Jinping must also receive agreement from the Politburo Standing Committee, or PSC, a group he leads as General Secretary, before he can launch. They collectively form some of the most valuable counsel that Jinping has available to him before his launch. About an hour before he gives the okay, He calls the members from the PSC and the Central Military Commission together for a meeting. His question is simple: should we go ahead? Opinions aren't unanimous. Some of China's political figures highlight that Beijing will be painting itself as the bad guy, not only in the West but much of Asia, far from being the peacekeeper and arbiter of global economic reform as it has painted itself to be over the last 2 decades. China will be seen as the nation that was willing to go nuclear at a critical moment. They're overruled. China's leading military generals argue that the situation on the ground is too devastating for China not to launch a nuke. Japan didn't fall thanks to the aid it received from the United States. Enemies are coming from all sides, and China's Belt and Road Initiative didn't do enough to help it establish a presence in other countries. If China doesn't launch, it loses. Wang Hubin, a former Navy commander and now the commander of the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF, is the most vocal of the voices claiming that a launch is needed. He reiterates the points he's made in the weeks and months leading up to this critical moment. Xu Shishang, the political commissar to the PLARF, backs Hubin's opinions. Jinping values both opinions. He installed both men into the PLARF in August 2023 because of their military experience and their loyalty to him. They won't steer him wrong. Jinping exercises caution. He won't launch just yet. Instead, China will launch at the top of the hour, assuming the situation continues to worsen. 42 minutes before China's nuclear launch. Disaster for China. Despite a strong defense, Beijing's sole military base in Djibouti falls, facing constant attacks from the American base in the country just 6 miles away and losing what little grip it has in Africa. Jinping watches as fortifications crumble and the 2,000 troops stationed at the base are overwhelmed. Losing the base is a massive blow. China had relied on it to launch naval attacks and sorties from the Horn of Africa. The base also allowed Beijing to keep an eye on the vital Red Sea corridor, through which much of its trade passed and through which it had received resources from its dwindling list of allies as the war dragged on. The Djibouti base has fallen. China no longer has eyes on the Red Sea. 41 minutes before China's nuclear launch. Sir, we must launch now. We can't delay. We must strike at the enemy's heart before they cause further damage to China. The impassioned plea comes from Wang Hubin. As a former naval captain, he knows better than anybody else what the loss of China's Djibouti base means. With its naval options now limited to launching from its own ports, China's docked ships are sitting ducks. It's already lost the few ships it had left in Djibouti, and those that were scheduled to come back to the base now have to divert course and try to find a safe route to China. Beijing's naval dominance is slipping away. However, it still has its Type 94 submarines sitting in the waters between Japan and Hawaii waiting to launch. Jinping hesitates. Making this decision would surely lead to retaliation in kind. But what option does he have? 40 minutes before China's nuclear launch. Jinping isn't yet prepared to launch. Before he does, he needs to warn his 2 major allies in this war of his intentions. Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un enter a conference call with the Chinese president, who informs them of his intention to strike the United States with weapons of mass destruction. Their opinion is not unanimous. For Kim Jong-un, this launch would be a realization of everything he'd ever worked toward when trying to form North Korea's own nuclear arsenal. He encourages Jinping, telling him that a strike against the United States now would weaken not only the US, but Japan and South Korea, now enemies of both China and North Korea. Emboldened, Jinping seeks Putin's opinion. The Russian president, as cagey as ever, is less enthusiastic about the launch. Though he is no stranger to making nuclear threats of his own, he knows what his cooperation with China in this launch could mean for Russia, that's still recovering from its war in Ukraine. He doesn't offer his approval, but he doesn't disapprove either. Putin intends to say nothing, perhaps waiting to see which side to hitch his wagon to if China follows through on its launch. 15 minutes before China's nuclear launch. Jinping isn't happy. Not having Putin's full support could be disastrous for China if it isn't sufficiently able to weaken the US with its nuclear strike. He holds a brief meeting with the Central Military Commission to answer a simple question: where do we strike? Hawaii, Alaska, and the American East Coast are all the answers that come from the meeting. Jinping will rely on his submarines to launch against Hawaii and California, with the destruction of the former also meaning that the US loses 12 bases and military installations. Multiple DF-1 launches will target Alaska, with Jinping hoping that the United States Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, or GMD system, which tracks incoming warheads and launches interceptor missiles to stop them, will be overwhelmed. The UCS often describes the GMD's response to nuclear missiles as hitting a bullet with a bullet. By sending several nuclear bullets in Alaska's direction, Jinping hopes to take away America's key Arctic asset. 12 minutes before China's nuclear launch. Bring me the codes. I'm prepared to launch. Though the Central Military Commission has successfully argued for this launch, it takes a moment for anybody to respond to Jinping's request. The gravity of what they're about to do weighs heavily. Finally, Wang Hubin takes charge, ordering his subordinates to put China's Type 94 submarines on high alert. Similar messages are sent to its DF-41 installations in Gansu, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. All three will launch and hopefully one will deliver its payload. Hubin personally delivers the briefcase containing China's nuclear launch codes to Jinping's desk. The room stands in silence as Jinping pores over the documents. He selects the specific bases in Hawaii, California, and Alaska that China will target, as well as which of his nuclear delivery options he'll use for each. Finally, he confirms the codes for each launch, delivering them to Hubin, who is tasked with relaying them to Beijing submarines and missile silos. There is no way to cancel the launch unless Jinping chooses to cancel. 5 minutes before China's nuclear launch, encrypted nuclear codes are sent to the 6 Type 94 submarines stationed near American waters, as well as to its trio of nuclear missile silos. Along with those codes are instructions, also encrypted, that detail who should be targeted with each missile, which nuclear warheads should be loaded onto the missiles, and when the launch should occur. Verification takes place. Though we know little of China's policies in this area, the military personnel who receive the orders likely need to confirm that the codes they've received are real. That confirmation comes through. China's DF-41 missile silos prepare for launch, with its submarine commanders ordering their troops to do the same. The PLA's Air Force mobilizes its H-6 pilots once again. They're responsible for making sure nothing on the sea can interfere with launches from China's subs. All the while, the commands are re-authenticated. 1 minute before China's nuclear launch, boxes are opened in China's missile silos and submarines. They contain keys, which are handed to the most senior personnel at each location. They will be used to launch China's nukes. The keys are entered into their slots and held in place. 10 seconds before China's nuclear launch, Xi Jinping sits quietly along with his military generals and political allies. They understand that this escalation could draw retaliation from the United States and its allies, and they can only hope that wiping out key installations on the eastern seaboard, as well as Hawaii and Alaska, will delay the response long enough for China to get close enough to follow up their attack. 1 second before China's nuclear launch, the keys are turned. China launches nuclear weapons from its 3 missile silos and the Type 94 submarines it has stationed near the United States. The engines of dozens of DF-41 and JL-2 missiles ignite, with the missiles then rocketing out of their firing bays. 5 minutes after China's nuclear launch, the missile strikes aren't immediate, with all having to travel distances of thousands of miles before they reach their targets. The JL-2s are capable of reaching Mach 20, roughly the equivalent of 15,345 miles per hour, meaning it'll take around 15 to 20 minutes to reach Hawaii. The DF-41s are faster, they can hit Mach 25, but they'll have further to travel. China's missile launches don't go unnoticed. Real-time satellite imagery reveals the launches, and the United States prepares its GMD response system. 15 to 20 minutes after China's nuclear launch, the GMD missile defense system is only partially successful. The system has only proven effective 55% of the time in extremely scripted tests, with America only able to reach a confidence level of 90% that they'll be able to take out an incoming missile when it launches 3 intercepting missiles simultaneously. Some of those interceptors succeed, destroying Chinese missiles above the Pacific Ocean, but enough get through to wreak devastation on Hawaii, Alaska, and the eastern seaboard. Key military installations are destroyed, but no missiles reach the White House. 30 minutes after China's nuclear launch, President Joe Biden sits in the White House. America's defenses couldn't prevent the impending Chinese nuclear strike. A war that he was winning has now escalated to the point of no return. The United States can't allow this strike to go unpunished. Preparations begin. An Army general delivers a set of documents to the president containing America's own nuclear codes and a list of confidential targets. In a matter of hours, the United States will launch its response to China, regardless of what its allies might think. The world is embroiled in chaos. Mutually assured destruction isn't guaranteed. Now it's just a race to see who can destroy who first. For China, its launch was a success to an extent, but it knows it has provoked the United States into a type of war from which there is no returning. Knowing that an American retaliatory strike is coming, Jinping leaves Beijing to move as close to China's western borders as possible. As he moves, he issues more commands. More DF-41s need to be fired from China's missile silos before America's retaliatory nukes can take them out. The rest of the world can do little more than watch, hoping that this escalation doesn't consume them as well. China will invade Taiwan within the next 3 years. Listen to many trusted sources, along with Chinese President Xi Jinping himself, and that's the impression you'll get. In his annual New Year's Eve address, Xi reiterated his oft-repeated claims that Taiwan will be reunified with China, with those claims coming on the back of constant military exercises in the Taiwan Strait in the run-up to the island nation's elections. The Stimson Center also points out many leading U.S. military officials believe that China is going to invade Taiwan at some point between now and 2027. Chief among them is General Mike Minahan, an Air Force general. In a memo obtained by NBC, Minahan says, "I hope I'm wrong. My gut tells me we will fight in 2025, referring to his belief that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent. And why wouldn't it be? China is a country that has vastly increased its military spending to the point where it now has one of the strongest armies in the world. On paper, its might far outweighs that of Taiwan, with the country being so strong that even the US would have to think twice before getting involved in the Taiwanese war. But what we see on paper may only tell part of the story. In fact, that paper is covering the cracks of a military that's in complete disarray. The fact is that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is now impossible. And in this video, we're going to answer the big question that's now on your mind. Why? To find the answer, we need to go back to December 2023, as Taiwan prepared for its upcoming elections amidst China's constant incursions over the Davis Line in the Taiwan Strait. Xi Jinping was busy doing something that's been a hallmark of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, for decades. He was conducting a purge. But this wasn't any old purge. In the past, Xi's purges, like those of his predecessors, have been focused on getting rid of the disloyal to ensure he maintains his power base. It's a tactic we've seen in totalitarian states for centuries. Stalin purged hundreds of past allies and suspected enemies when he ruled the Soviet Union. Saddam Hussein did the same in Iraq. For Xi, the purges may not always be as lethal, but they are no less effective. However, the purge at the end of 2023 didn't involve simply getting rid of officials who weren't doing a good enough job towing the party's and thus Xi's line. Instead, they focused on 9 senior military officers, at least 3 of whom were believed to be part of China's rocket force, in a move that likely foreshadows an impending punishment for those officials. Some believe the purge to be the first and will likely be a series during 2024. That's certainly the opinion of Alfred Wu, an associate professor at Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, who says more heads will roll. The purge that centered around the rocket force is not over. And the interesting thing is that this isn't the first instance of prominent Chinese officials doing disappearing acts in 2023. Earlier in the year, a former defense minister named Wei Fenghe, who happened to be former head of the People's Liberation Army's or PLA's rocket force, seemingly vanished without a trace. The man who followed in his footsteps as defense minister, Li Shangfu, suffered the same fate. He was removed from the position in October after disappearing for several months. One of Shangfu's deputies was also among the ministers purged in this most recent display of Xi Jinping's power. When asked in August why Wei Fenghe had been removed from his position, a spokesperson from China's defense ministry was abrupt in his response. The PLA has zero tolerance for corruption. And it's in these mentions of corruption that we start to see Xi Jinping's reasonings for the purges. You might have noticed that we've mentioned the PLA's rocket force several times in this video. Fenghe was a former head of the group, with 3 of the 9 men purged at the end of 2023 also being high-ranking officials within the rocket force. It's supposed to be the jewel in the PLA's crown, the group that's responsible for developing the missiles that the PLA will use to not only attack Taiwan, but to bolster its nuclear threat to the point where it could rival that of the US and Russia. The shine on that jewel has disappeared. In January 2024, Bloomberg published a report claiming that US intelligence had shown several flaws in the missiles the rocket force was building for Xi. The big headline? Many of China's missiles are filled with water rather than fuel. The Federation of American Scientists, or FAS, followed up on that report with one of their own. In it, the FAS highlighted several of the claims made in Bloomberg's report. These included several missile silo lids that were apparently not fully operational, essentially meaning that they can't be relied upon to open or close should Beijing need to launch a nuclear missile. But more worrying for Xi, the intelligence suggests that several of China's missile silo fields may have components or even entire stages that are filled with water instead of rocket fuel. We don't need to state the obvious here, but we'll do it anyway. A rocket can't launch without fuel. The findings call into question practically all the reports the world has been seeing about China's growing nuclear capabilities Over the last 3 years, military modernization has been at the forefront of Xi's plans since he took office. The Arms Control Association believes that China has at least 410 nukes, with some in the US claiming it'll be up to 1,500, matching the US and Russia by 2035. These nukes need missiles to power them to their destinations, and prior to these reports coming out, China seemed to be near the top of the field in that department too. As recently as November 2023, The Telegraph reported that the US Department of Defense was working on a new intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, that would be capable of leaving the Earth's atmosphere, traveling enormous distances at 20 times the speed of sound before hitting the target. All of these reports are now being called into question. For years, the missiles the rocket force has been building have been a significant part of the multifaceted threat that Beijing has presented to the world. Now that we know some of them are apparently loaded with water rather than fuel, an obvious question arises: how many? Is this a case of Xi catching some of his most trusted military officials in a few isolated acts of trying to take shortcuts as they attempt to keep pace with his desire for modernization? Or is the water problem endemic to the point where it affects a huge portion of China's missile supply? We can't know for sure, but we can certainly speculate that Xi's latest purge was a direct response to these flawed rockets, especially given that a third of the party members who are now gone were part of the rocket force. More worryingly for Xi, this is far from the first instance of corruption in his military ranks, putting a damper on his ambitions. In 2015, War on the Rocks reported that corruption within the PLA had long been a subject of great interest for both the international and Chinese media. Back then, accusations of theft, extortion, bribery, and mistrust seemed to mar the military, with the general consensus being that Xi would have to get a handle on these issues to enact his modernization plans. And that's what he's been trying to do. These latest reports leave Xi with egg on his face. Not only are the missile silo lids not working while some of the rockets are filled with water, but other reports suggest that even rank-and-file members of the PLA are engaged in thievery. One ex-PLA official spoke on Radio Free Asia to claim that problems like these have existed in the rocket force for years, even claiming that the troops would steal solid fuel from Chinese rockets to, of all things, cook hot pot. He reasoned that the troops have so few supplies that they needed something with which they could cook. The official even claimed that soldiers could simply walk into an armory and ask for a small round piece of solid fuel, which was supposed to be used in the missiles so that they could cook. As funny as this story might appear, it seems to show the rocket force wasn't doing enough to keep its troops stocked up with the far simpler fuels and equipment they need for cooking. Did she simply not assign enough money for basic provisions? Or has that money ended up going to places it shouldn't have, leaving his troops to make stew of meats, vegetables, and other foods using literal rocket fuel? It likely isn't the former, which suggests the rocket force isn't running as it should. All of this adds up to a simple conclusion: China's rockets may not be as ready to launch in the short term as many believe them to be. It would take a lot of hot pots to account for the missing fuel. Clearly, there's a far bigger problem that Xi's trying to solve with his purges, but when it comes to using those flawed rockets in the short term, it looks like he's out of luck. And that brings us neatly to Taiwan. In April 2023, Reuters reported on China running military drills. Lasting for 3 days, these exercises began when the Taiwanese president returned from a visit to the United States, essentially making them a warning: this is how we might attack your island. What's important here is to think about the nature of those drills. Taiwan's defense ministry reported that along with several air sorties, the drills focused on how China might conduct precision missile strikes against Taiwan in the event of an invasion. On its WeChat account, the Chinese military shared a short animation that emulated the attacks the country was simulating during the drill. The video shows missiles being fired from the land, air, and sea directly into Taiwan, suggesting that a large part of China's strategy would be to unleash a missile barrage on the island nation. This is far from the only simulation that assumes China will use a missile barrage on Taiwan. In August 2023, the RAND Corporation ran its own wargame simulations under the assumption that China's approach would be to launch a massive barrage of missiles at Taiwan as part of their invasion. Before implementing any of its proposed solutions, RAND's game saw the US losing over 100 of its 5th-generation aircraft due to missile strikes. RAND then lowered that to about 50 losses after implementing an array of countermeasures. The solutions aren't the key point here. It's the assumptions about China's approach to Taiwan. Missiles, missiles, and more missiles. Are you starting to see the problem here? The recent purge, along with Bloomberg's revelations, show that corruption appears to be endemic in China's rocket force. We know that several of its missiles are compromised. either because they're launching from faulty silos or they're not launching at all, due to being filled with water instead of fuel. If China's approach to Taiwan is going to be missile-focused, Xi absolutely cannot feel confident in the strategy that he's been so carefully developing over the last few years. Missiles may no longer be an option for China. At the very least, they won't be an option until Xi can find trusted people to not only inspect the missile stores that he was waiting to hit Taiwan with, but also replace the missiles that have been subject to such rampant corruption. All of these checks will take time, and that's time that Taiwan can use to strengthen fortifications and deepen its alliance with the United States. And speaking of the US, all the time that China will have to waste on checking its missile stocks allows America to build a stronger presence near Taiwan. The country already announced plans to build 4 new military bases in the Philippines in April 2023, including a naval base and an airport. That'll allow it to oversee what's happening between China and Taiwan from a strategically advantageous location. China can ill afford to launch an invasion once those bases are completed. That's why it needed to strike within the next few years to have the best chance of succeeding while invading Taiwan. But now Xi can't rely on the missiles he planned to use to do the job, because for all he knows, those missiles may not even be capable of launching. And if launching could be a problem, who's to say that stalled missiles might not detonate and wreak havoc on China's own military bases? The result is Xi would have to cut the missiles out of his Taiwan strategy. Still, that leaves him with a pretty powerful navy and an increasingly modernized air force, plus China has far more ground troops than Taiwan, over 2 million active personnel versus Taiwan's 215,000. So perhaps a ground-based invasion would be an option. But therein lies another problem for Xi. If he can't trust his missiles, can he trust anything else in the military? He'll know that he has working boats and planes. He's been running drills with them in the Taiwan Strait for most of the latter half of 2023. But learning that so many shortcuts were taken with his missiles will lead to more questions. Were similar shortcuts taken with anything else? Will our planes fly as long as they should? Can our subs launch torpedoes and missiles reliably? The single instance of corruption in the rocket force could be the tip of the iceberg that Xi and his comrades are just beginning to unravel. His purges are supposed to be a measure to prevent this type of corruption. They're the message he sends to his government. Fail me and suffer the consequences. But purges are nothing new in China, meaning they weren't a deterrent for the most recent rocket force members who were purged. Who's to say that this latest purge will do the trick? Questions upon questions now exist, which is the last thing Xi will want if he's gearing up to invade Taiwan. He needs to know that every strategy he deploys and every piece of equipment his forces use will work the way it's supposed to. After all, China spent hundreds of billions of dollars on modernization. Xi can't go into a Taiwan invasion lacking confidence in the fruits of all that spending. But if he were to invade in the next couple years, that's exactly the situation he'd face. Xi clearly isn't confident in his military. That's the key takeaway from his purges. But that lack of confidence creates another issue, regardless of how well-founded it might be. Every purge damages morale. Imagine how it might have felt to be a high-ranking military officer in the wake of Xi's December 2023 purge. The odds are you're not thinking about formulating strategies or making sure your small part of the military is functioning correctly at that moment in time. You're worried, fearful of your leader, and worst of all, you've just watched as people who might have been your friends or comrades have disappeared from command. The focus will switch from who the military should target next to who Xi will target within the military. And if you have a whiff of the corruption that Xi is looking for around you, odds are you might be next. Christina Chen, who works at the Taiwan Institute for National Defense and Security Research, or INDSR, as a research fellow, thinks that morale will be a major issue for China going forward. Speaking to Al Jazeera, she says, more removals might follow, and that could further weaken the morale of the military and its ability to fight. The mention of ability to fight here is critical. Shaking up at the highest levels of the chains of military command causes reverberations that are felt at every level. The lowest soldier may not know much about why Xi is conducting his purges. China likely isn't going to be telling its troops about the issues with its missiles, but they'll feel the impact caused by leadership changes as they create uncertainty in the ranks. What may have been a well-oiled strategy before is now mired in confusion. New people ascend to leadership positions. They may clash with the officials who managed to keep their jobs, and those new people also need to learn fast. All the while, Xi might focus on conducting more purges, not just to weed out corrupt members of his military, but to ensure that his people are forced into loyalty. That brings us to another problem. Xi may be focused more on loyalty than invading Taiwan right now. China is struggling economically for the first time in years. youth unemployment rocketed up to 21.3% in June 2023, a record high during Xi's time in charge, after which the Chinese government announced it would no longer be publishing that particular statistic. The country's property market is in shambles thanks to many of China's leading developers taking on so much debt they can no longer pay it back. And as for manufacturing, which employs 18% of China's workforce, global demand is slackening due to other players entering the industry and Xi's own Made in China 2025 policy. These are all massive problems for Xi. For years, he's been able to rely on China's economic prosperity not only to strengthen the country's military, but also ensure loyalty from its people. Sure, fear has always played into his strategy, but Xi has positioned himself as the figurehead of a new, stronger, and more prosperous China, which has seeped through to many aspects of the nation. Now that there are such major economic problems in China, Xi can no longer rely on the economy as a way to build loyalty. Hence, his purges. If you can't make them loyal by providing good times, make them loyal through fear. The problem with this approach, beyond that fear is creating resentment, is that Xi has to move his focus internally. That's what we've seen with these most recent purges. Rather than being able to focus on how he's going to use his missiles and other equipment to invade Taiwan, he now has to concentrate on ensuring his own military does what he tells it to do. Add to all of this a simple fact: Taiwan isn't an easy nation to conquer. If it were, China would have done it decades ago. After all, merging Taiwan with China has been on the Chinese agenda since the days of Chairman Mao, but it's never happened for several reasons. One, and perhaps the most prominent, is that Taiwan has generally been bolstered by support from the United States. We discussed this earlier when discussing America's new bases in the Philippines. Though the US hasn't made a definitive commitment to sending its military in if China launches an invasion, Xi will know that war with Taiwan risks bringing the US into the fold. That is a big enough problem when he felt confident in his missiles. Now it would be suicide. Second, Taiwan's geography makes it extremely difficult to invade via land. Mountainous terrain runs through the island's center, with Taiwan recognizing that bunkering down in these regions will make it very hard for China to take over. Sure, Xi might be able to land troops along Taiwan's 970 miles of coast, but whether those troops could be effective is another question, especially when Taiwan has mountain bunkers, such as its hidden Chiashan Air Base, from which it could fend off Chinese attacks. So Beijing would have to rely on a coordinated attack involving planes, ships, and missiles, bringing us back to the rocket force's corruption. And there are other issues. The Taiwan Strait is usually a choppy passage of water, largely thanks to a pair of monsoon seasons that hit the strait each year. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, a seaborne invasion is only possible for a few months every year, further shortening the window of invasion opportunity for Xi. China has to cross the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan only has to defend itself. The thousands of troops that would be required to get the appropriate numbers of troops onto the island would take several weeks to make the crossing. All the while, they'd be battered by Taiwanese defenses and potentially American forces. And even if those ships managed to land, they'd be limited to parts of Taiwan's coast that have ports. Taiwan would have the option of destroying those ports, making them useless to China. Should China get past all of that, it would then have to engage in urban warfare, fighting street by street in a drawn-out conflict that would be far from the smash and grab that many envision an invasion of Taiwan to be. And that's why Xi favored the missile barrage he had the military simulating in early 2023. That barrage isn't possible anymore. At least it's not possible to launch it with the level of confidence Xi needs to have in his military to devastate Taiwan from afar rather than landing on the island. So an invasion of Taiwan likely isn't in the cards for Beijing anymore. It can't trust its missiles, and the strategy it intended to use is out the window. But what do you think? Is this a temporary reprieve for Taiwan, allowing it to fortify while China rebuilds? Or is China's missile problem not as big a barrier to invasion as it seems? Starting with the forced liquidation of Evergrande, once China's largest real estate developer, 2024 is not shaping up to be a good year for the Chinese economy. Serious problems are on the horizon, not only for the millions of hopeful buyers who paid for construction projects that were never started, but also for the many businesses that work with Evergrande, construction firms and material suppliers that will now face huge losses and the threat of bankruptcy. But perhaps the biggest hit will be felt by China's broader financial system, its many banks and creditors that will ultimately be forced to reduce lending and increase interest rates, resulting in a credit crunch that will make it a nightmare for companies to borrow money. When Evergrande Real Estate eventually died after defaulting and losing 99% of its value over the past 3 years, it owned more than 1,300 separate projects in more than 280 cities across China. The Evergrande Group, on the other hand, owns a range of businesses, from wealth management companies to electric car manufacturers to food and drink makers. It once even owned a controlling stake in one of China's biggest football teams, Guangzhou FC. Some experts believe that the collapse of this giant, even if the government steps in to bail them out, is a sign that China could be following a similar path as Japan in the 1980s, just before it slipped into decades of economic hardship. After years of financial strain, Country Garden, another major player in the real estate industry, also appears to be on the brink of liquidation, perhaps only months behind Evergrande. But they aren't the only ones. With numerous other developers also in default and more than $100 billion in debt payments going unpaid, the lingering question seems to be, how will the implosion of China's real estate sector impact the country's broader financial system? However this plays out, it certainly doesn't look like China's many struggling real estate developers will be getting much help from the government. In fact, according to Nihong, China's Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, companies that have lost their ability to operate should restructure or go bankrupt, while any company that harms the public like Evergrande can expect to be punished. In fact, Beijing has already shown it would rather step in and restructure these failing companies than bail them out. According to a Chinese state media report, the government's planning to merge 3 of the country's biggest debt managers into a sovereign wealth fund and call it China Investment Corp. The trouble for companies like Evergrande, which is some $300 billion in the red, really started after Beijing cracked down on the common practice of using debt to finance growth, hoping to put a stop to blind, reckless expansion. When it came time for some of China's largest real estate developers to pay their bills, however, many didn't have the cash and had to default. And when Chinese homebuyers realized they'd been giving money every month to companies that didn't have any of their own, they started to panic. In China, nearly 3/4 of household wealth is tied to property, which means the life savings of millions of Chinese citizens could be about to disappear. Many homebuyers have simply stopped making mortgage payments to protest construction delays for their unbuilt apartments. If this trend continues and more prospective buyers refuse to pay their mortgages, demand will continue to fall, dragging prices down in a vicious cycle. Property sales in China's residential and commercial sectors grew steadily for the past 2 decades, until 2023, when they slowly began to drop. Starting in 2019, the construction of new residential projects plummeted by 58%, a concerning turn of events for those who'd already paid. People, too, will stop buying properties if they don't look like they'll ever be built. So all across China, sales numbers started to fall as millions of homes already paid for were undelivered. Unfortunately, this death spiral can only be reversed by renewing the confidence of homebuyers in both developers and the market, but that'll be no easy task. Experts don't foresee any meaningful recovery of the real estate market coming in 2024. And this slump in the property sector has already begun to drag down China's economy, leading to widespread layoffs, financial insecurity for millions, and increased criticism of the Chinese Communist Party. Before this current crisis, however, before China slammed its doors to the wider world during the COVID-19 pandemic, and long before China ever saw an upward surge in nearly every economic and quality of life metric, it had to survive a very different sort of housing crisis. Entering the 1980s, not only was urban China seriously overcrowded, but it was also dingy, dangerous, and anti-modern. By 1985, 90% of urban households lacked piped gas, 70% lacked private toilets, and nearly 40% relied on shared kitchens and water taps. Due to rapid demographic change, corruption, and widespread poverty, China had a serious housing problem. And yet the government had no real incentive to build, given that throughout the 1980s, housing was the sole responsibility of the state. On the upside, this made housing quite inexpensive. Rent accounted for just 1 to 3% of a person's average income. However, this more affordable approach also made the construction of additional housing a low-profit enterprise. Unlike other types of investing, housing development would generate little to no revenue, so the state wasn't interested. At the time, however, private development was still outright illegal, and so China's housing crunch went from bad to worse. Then, in 1988, along came Deng Xiaoping, a prominent politician and a reformer who initiated a real estate revolution in China that a decade-long development boom would follow. It all started with a single-sentence addition to the Constitution that allowed government-owned land to be transferred to local governments to use basically however they wanted. Looking to fund their own local infrastructure projects, they could now lease large sections of land to property developers, who could in turn build housing for a growing Chinese middle class that was flush with cash and eager for more space. And just like that, China had a red-hot private real estate and development sector. From 1998 to 2002, urban living space and home ownership skyrocketed as ambitious developers built enough housing to accommodate the entire United States population. This looked like an opportunity to the people in and outside of China, but to massive developers like Evergrande, it felt much more like a race. So to keep up with stiff competition and ever-increasing demand, they embraced an absurdly high-leverage strategy. Similar to other developers, they would finance construction projects through a combination of upfront buyer payments and loans. But it was their willingness to accept huge amounts of risk that got them in trouble. For one, they didn't bother to maintain cash reserves big enough to cover their debts, let's say if sales dropped off. Nor did they wait to confirm a project would even be profitable before borrowing the money to start the next one. Instead, they focused only on construction speed, completely ignoring their insane amount of debt accumulation. But why would they, when their risky business model was consistently rewarded as new building projects continued to sell out before they could even be started? The rapid growth period also provided a rare opportunity for the Chinese public, who could now invest their money in an asset with a proven track record. It also provided a significant source of income for local governments, allowing them to improve local infrastructure and better fund social services. Perhaps most importantly, though, it created millions of jobs. But even as housing in China quickly became one of the cornerstones of its now formidable economy, all of this building still failed to fulfill its primary purpose. It failed to actually provide people with housing, mainly because when the dust settled, the property prices in China's major cities were outrageous, comparable to those in Los Angeles, Paris, or London, but in an economy where the average person earned about a quarter as much. As vacancy rates climbed, yet rapid construction continued, it became clear that the current market was inflated, propped up mostly by the belief that prices would continue to rise indefinitely. In other words, the housing market had become a bubble. By this time, Evergrande had millions of unfinished apartments that had already been sold. But to finish them, to pay the builders, laborers, and suppliers, they would need to borrow more money. Due to Beijing's new restrictions, however, they couldn't take on any more debt. Their cash reserves dwindled, and they found themselves unable to reverse course by starting new projects. Even if they could have, though, the market had changed. Due to drawn-out COVID restrictions, the Chinese economy was barely back on its feet. At that same time, vast numbers of migrant workers who'd been struggling to find work and affordable housing in the cities headed back to their rural homelands. The housing boom was over, and China's economic situation was about to get very precarious. Since 1978, when China opened itself up to the global market, its annual GDP has grown at an average rate of 9%. However, driven down by decreased retail spending and the disastrous real estate problem, its GDP growth recently plunged to a repeated quarterly increase of just 0.8%. Year after year, exports to China's three largest trading partners, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the EU, and the US, have also continued to decline. On the other hand, a sanction-burdened Russia has seen an increase of over 50%, but this still hasn't been nearly enough to counterbalance the overall downward trend. Last year, the Chinese yuan briefly fell to a 16-year low against the US dollar, while the stock market has lost approximately $6 trillion in value over the last year and a half. But even if Beijing has taken steps to put a floor under the market, mainly by pushing state-controlled funds to buy stocks, restricting short selling, and talking up the market, this has scared the heck out of many foreign investors after making big bets on China a year ago, in expectation of a post-COVID economic boom. An estimated 90% of last year's most confident investors have pulled out, many feeling the sting of repeated defaults by China's biggest property companies. The ongoing tension between the US and China, sparked mostly by Taiwan, has also led some foreign investors to tread carefully in Chinese markets. And it certainly doesn't look good when the regulators in Washington declare Chinese companies, mostly technology companies and state-owned firms, off limits to US investors, ultimately forcing them to delist from American exchanges. China originally opened its markets to foreigners to attract stable long-term institutional investment, and some fund managers will probably return if the economy and the market start showing signs of life. However, a meaningful recovery at this point will require a forceful response to the property crisis and a sustained effort to stimulate the economy. In troubling times like these, wary foreign investors always have the option to jump ship. But what about the hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens who have no choice but to face the crisis head-on? Over the past few years, China has seen a huge increase in unemployment, especially among the country's youth, so huge that in June 2023, the government stopped publicly reporting the numbers after the rates continued to reach record highs of more than 21%, and as high as 40% in rural regions, and even as high as 50% when part-time work and underemployment were factored in. Also, because so many new college graduates are entering the labor market, approximately 12 million in 2024, there simply aren't enough jobs to go around. Government regulations have too hindered the growth of many industries that typically employ young people, such as technology. But that's not all. Given the high cultural demands on Chinese workers, who are routinely expected to work a 9-9-6 schedule from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, many have simply chosen to opt out. Instead of grueling hours, low pay, and a straight path toward burnout, many of China's young people have chosen not to work or engage in any economic activities, or become professional children, relying on their parents and grandparents to support them. It must also be taken into consideration that higher death rates and lower birth rates, even after 10 years without the one-child policy, have put a disproportionate amount of pressure on young Chinese women to stay home and raise children. Societal norms might discourage them from joining the workforce, and employers can be hesitant to hire them. With fewer people working in China, the average citizen is spending far less than they have in the past, putting a big dent in the consumer market. Real estate prices have tumbled, youth unemployment has peaked, and after 2 decades of increases, wages have stagnated. So, to try to encourage wary consumers to spend rather than save, the Chinese government has introduced a number of incentives. Drivers who trade in older cars for newer models will be eligible for subsidies, as will rural households that buy insulation and other home renovation materials to improve energy efficiency, while entrance fees at certain scenic sites will be discounted to promote domestic tourism. It's unknown what proportion of these incentives the central government actually intends to pay for. Many provincial governments are already struggling to pay the salaries of their civil servants and interest on their debts, so covering the cost of these new consumer subsidies will likely be a struggle. For better or worse, China's approach to stimulating consumer spending has differed considerably compared to those used by the US during the pandemic, which was essentially send people money. This tactic led millions of Americans to spend their stimulus checks on manufactured goods imported from China, like consumer electronics and exercise equipment. On the other hand, China's policies force consumers to purchase goods and services that are almost entirely produced in China. In theory, simply sending checks to nervous households might only prompt them to put that money in the bank. During this recent holiday season, however, there were a few signs that life might be returning to China's mostly flattened consumer market. For one, holiday travel numbers were up. Not as high as pre-pandemic levels, but there was an improvement. Encouraged by government policies, increased supply, and propaganda, domestic tourists spent a total of 632.7 billion yuan, around $87.9 billion during the Chinese Lunar New Year period. An average of 1.69 million trips per day were made in and out of mainland China, including Hong Kong and Macau, but those numbers were still far below pre-pandemic averages. Movie ticket sales reached a record 8 billion yuan, around $1.1 billion during the 8-day holiday period. However, increased spending at the box office isn't nearly enough to turn China's troubled economy around. The truth is, people are still nervous. This cautious behavior, though, has created serious concerns for many companies that have relied heavily on China for much of their growth. Huge multinational corporations like Starbucks, McDonald's, and Ralph Lauren got swept up in China's economic success. In 2005, Volkswagen sold over 500,000 cars in China. By 2019, that number had reached 4 million. Sales for Apple products too climbed from about $13 billion in 2011 to closer to $70 billion in 2021, more than quintupling in a single decade. China's also created a problem for itself in terms of interest rates, as if it didn't have enough troubles already. In contrast to what many of the major central banks belonging to the world's largest economies have done, sharply raise interest rates to combat inflation, China has continued to reduce borrowing costs, attempting to support its struggling economy and property market. Chinese banks have created two other problems. One, the lowering of interest rates could put more pressure on an already weakened yuan. And two, rather than reinvesting domestically, many Chinese businesses are choosing to move their funds overseas. Most of these companies have plans for major Chinese expansion, but has this rising star reached its apex? And what happens if China can't recover? Overall, things would likely get very bad for the global economy. The question is, how bad? However, to properly answer that question, we need again to glance back at certain events that took place over the past 2 decades. For a long time, China's growth appeared unstoppable, as it evolved into a manufacturing powerhouse, and its GDP consistently saw double-digit growth. In 2010, China even surpassed Japan to become the world's second-largest economy after the United States. So, what happened? Well, the COVID-19 pandemic, for one. In the initial stages of the pandemic, due to widespread isolation measures and lockdowns, China's economy basically shut, which led to a 6.8% drop in GDP during the first quarter of 2020, with sectors like wholesale goods, retail, construction, transportation, and tourism all taking a devastating hit. For years, China stuck with a strict zero-COVID policy, as local governments were forced to spend huge amounts of money on quarantine measures and testing. At the same time, businesses, factories, and even entire cities were shut down over a handful of infections. In spite of this, China's economy slowly started to recover, and by 2021, as the domestic economy slowly began to reopen, its GDP growth had crept back up to 8.1%. During this period, China's exports also reached record highs, which helped offset economic damage caused by ongoing lockdowns. But new challenges await in 2022. Due to outbreaks of the Omicron variant and renewed control measures, again China's GDP growth dipped, this time down to a mere 3%, well below the government's target of 5.5%. Cases surged. Consumer consumption, public services and entertainment, and the property sector all took a beating. Uncertainty surrounding COVID-19 prompted many Chinese citizens to bulk up their savings instead of putting money back into the economy. And in terms of foreign investment, a number of businesses started to rapidly pull their money out of China. Falling interest rates and continued disputes with the U.S. have only added to the concerns of many companies and investors. After a string of pandemic-related supply chain issues, even Apple started to shift some of its production needs elsewhere. In 2023, some 12 to 14% of Apple's global iPhone shipments came from India, and they're expected to increase that to 20 to 25% in 2024. This might be bad news for China, but not for India, which is slowly becoming a key market for Apple, after opening its first 2 official retail stores in 2023. Over the past 20 years, China has also forged deep economic ties with several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, making it the region's largest single trading partner. For example, China buys 1/5 of the region's exports, mostly metals, minerals, and fuel, while providing most of the manufactured goods and machinery imported by these countries, which means that China's economic problems are also Africa's. Given a 1 percentage point decline in China's growth rate, could reduce the average growth in the region by 1/4 percentage point within a year. Complicating things further are China's new export restrictions on gallium and germanium, 2 of the raw materials that are key to semiconductor production. Given that China produces 80% of the world's gallium and 60% of the world's germanium, this hoarding of materials is likely in response to the coordinated effort of the US, Netherlands, and Japan to choke off China's access to semiconductor technology. Viewed internationally as a major geopolitical and economic power play, this could significantly slow down China's efforts to develop its own domestic chip industry and hurt major Chinese tech firms like Huawei, SMIC, and HiSilicon that rely on cutting-edge foreign chips. By forcing China to rely on older, slower chip technologies, however, as well as disrupting the supply of critical components for a wide range of Chinese products, from smartphones to military equipment, this might also hurt those nations who rely on Chinese-made technology in return. For example, Beijing has placed restrictions on firms linked to the American military, such as the aerospace company Lockheed Martin. The long-term impact of these bans will likely hinge on China's ability to achieve self-reliance in semiconductor production, as it takes steps to enhance its domestic chip capabilities. However, even as many Western governments move to become less reliant on China for both raw materials and finished products, diversifying supply chains and building up the capability to mine and process the materials essential for chip production could take years. But even if this tug-of-war for resources creates an economic opportunity for mineral-rich countries such as Australia and Canada, experts warn that weaponizing resources this way could come with negative consequences in terms of the environment, as important advancements in new green technologies also rely on these same materials, making this not a national problem but a problem for the whole human race. The general public doesn't care about the availability of gallium and germanium, but most people do care about how much a new car will cost or how expensive it'll be to switch to solar. I've made clear with President Xi that we seek competition, not conflict, President Biden said in his 2023 State of the Union speech, responding to increased hostilities between the world's two largest economies, which together account for roughly 40% of the global GDP. Starting with a series of tariffs imposed by former President Donald Trump, followed by the Biden administration's restrictions on access to chip technology, combined with tension surrounding Taiwan, there's been a near-total collapse of trust between the U.S. and China, which has led not only to a reduction of direct investment by U.S. businesses, but also the real threat of war if China ends up trying to invade Taiwan. It's no secret that China has never accepted Taiwan as an independent country, but while the communist China of the past believed it could simply wait for Taiwan to be drawn back in by the mainland's massive economy and 1.4 billion strong population, that no longer seems to be a realistic option. Over the years, Taiwan, a small island of just 24 million people, 160 kilometers off the coast of southern China, has developed into a sturdy democracy with a political culture that starkly contrasts China's current autocratic system. While it doesn't exactly fit the traditional model of a dictatorship, where power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual, the Communist Party of China maintains tight control over the government, military, media, and civil society, which has made the Taiwanese even more determined to not reunify. With that said, if an increasingly impatient Beijing was somehow able to reel Taiwan back in without using violence, corruption, or coercion, the leadership in Washington would simply have to accept that. But anything else would likely lead to a war. At times, the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan looks inevitable, with conflict kicking off sometime in 2025 or 2027. Other military analysts, however, have argued that the likelihood of war remains quite low. Still others say that if China were to attack Taiwan, much of the blame could be placed on the deteriorating relationship between Beijing and Washington. A lot of the tension surrounding Taiwan comes from the growing conflict between these two major global powers. For one, Beijing doesn't like at all that Taiwan has fallen within the sphere of U.S. influence, but it also must recognize that any military action against Taiwan would be viewed as a direct attack on U.S. interests. This also means that if China-U.S. relations completely fall apart, President Xi Jinping won't have to worry about the feelings of whoever's occupying the White House when he ultimately moves on Taiwan. However, if President Xi, who has long sought to solidify his position as China's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, can't turn China's economy around, he might not be the one handling the problem. When the economy was booming, the Chinese population was more willing to accept the CCP's tighter controls on things like freedom of speech. However, a faltering economy doesn't usually create a sense of confidence in the person ruling the country. After having amassed the greatest amount of concentrated power and influence since Mao, it seems that China's once unquestionable leader is losing his infallible image. At the moment, President Xi's problems are many: troubled relations with neighbors, a sinking economy, fierce competition with the U.S., increasingly frustrated citizens, a military that's not nearly as capable as it seems, rampant corruption at the highest levels of the CCP, and an independent Taiwan that refuses to bend the knee. Right now, though, President Xi's having a tough time keeping his carefully chosen allies on his side. He's worked hard to rid himself of opponents from the Communist Youth League and the Shanghai Gang, but lately he's been finding more enemies within his own camp. He seems committed to purging disloyal or questionable officials, even those previously of his emerging Xi Jinping faction. Then there was the mysterious death of the former premier Li Keqiang, a longtime rival of Xi Jinping who had a sudden heart attack in a swimming pool. It's these actions and untimely coincidences that make it unlikely that President Xi will lose his status as ruler for life anytime soon. But the unwavering loyalty that he demands from his top subordinates, not to mention the Chinese people, could be at risk. Governmental hubris, marked by illegal actions and blatant disregard for others, has also turned a number of international friends into enemies. After meeting with President Marcos of the Philippines in early 2023, President Xi promised to resolve their differences peacefully. Instead, Filipino fishermen working within their exclusive economic zone continued to be harassed by the Chinese Coast Guard. And it's perhaps due to this increasing lack of allies that President Xi has decided to double down on his friendship with Russia and North Korea, which is now supplying ballistic missiles to Putin for use in Ukraine. Israel's also investigating how Chinese weapons and equipment ended up in the hands of Hamas fighters. The most likely answer? Via Iran. But China did train and arm Palestinian factions back in 1992, prior to re-establishing ties with Israel. Still, even though Israel and China were once close allies, Beijing refuses to condemn Hamas and has even accused Israel of pushing their attacks beyond the scope of self-defense. Amidst all of this, the Chinese government is also waging an assault on religion, subjecting millions of Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and other religious groups to arbitrary detention, forced labor, and torture, while destroying religious buildings, books, and artifacts. This has been the most apparent with the ongoing mistreatment of Uyghur Muslims, a campaign of persecution that has been readily described as genocide, as reports of internment camps, forced sterilization, and suppression of religious practices have continued to become public. The Chinese government has also recently intensified its repression of Christians, both Catholics and Protestants. This has included the demolition of churches, the arrests of pastors and church attendees, and the forced installation of surveillance cameras in churches. The government, too, has been retranslating the Bible to establish a correct understanding that's more in line with Chinese culture and the Chinese Communist Party's ideology. Since 2018, the Bible has only been available for purchase via government-sanctioned retailers. Large numbers of Tibetan Buddhist monks and lay practitioners have also faced extensive surveillance, limits on travel and communication, and detainment. Ordinary citizens, too, have been subjected to increased controls and surveillance, making it very difficult for the public to openly express dissent or criticism of the president or his policies. But this hasn't been able to thwart the sharp increase in labor protests, which more than tripled in the fourth quarter of 2023, compared with the same period the year before. Independent data from the Hong Kong-based China Labor Bulletin, which promotes Chinese workers' rights, recorded an additional 183 protests between January 1st and February 3rd, 2024. These disputes have been largely fueled by 1. Inadequate enforcement of labor protections, and 2. The absence of effective labor unions. However, the root cause of China's rise in labor protests clearly rests on its broader economic challenges. As manufacturing orders have declined, many Chinese companies have struggled with financial difficulties that directly impact workers. Then there's the implosion of the Chinese real estate sector, which has made construction workers especially likely to protest. Previously, the Chinese government has been able to overcome a range of severe economic and financial obstacles. Most of these have been due to its own highly inefficient and risky growth model, but still the CCP has so far managed to maneuver the economy around a banking crisis, massive currency devaluation, a housing market meltdown, and impending economic collapse. Each of these near misses, however, has come at a cost, primarily a massive buildup in domestic debt, huge losses in foreign exchange reserves, and highly unpredictable prices for stocks, property, and other once stable assets. And yet, even if no larger economic crisis develops, China's future still seems very fragile, as its growth will remain constrained by unfavorable demographics, high debt levels, and an inefficient financial system. If only Beijing plays its cards right, it seems, will the future of the Chinese economy see moderate growth and fewer emergencies down the road. Whatever the economic fate of China, U.S. taxpayers should be prepared to absorb some of the cost, given that for much of the past 3 decades, China has been one of the single biggest investors in U.S. Treasury bonds sold by the U.S. government to pay for public services. Why, you ask, would China want to buy so many of these bonds? Well, there are 2 primary motivations behind this. First, China wants the yuan's value to remain pegged to the dollar's value. A dollar-pegged yuan helps keep down the cost of Chinese exports. This also provides stability to the yuan, since the dollar is still seen as one of the safest currencies in the world. This is the second reason for buying up U.S. Treasury bonds. They're essentially redeemable in dollars. Because China owns so much U.S. debt, nearly $860 billion worth, it's been politically popular to say that China owns the United States. But the reality of the situation is less dramatic. Hypothetically, if China did call in all of its treasury holdings at once, which is not actually possible, the US dollar would go down, while the yuan would likely go up, with the biggest consequence being that Chinese consumer goods would become more costly for US buyers. Deterring Americans from buying their products, though, won't do China any favors. All the issues previously discussed, plus the ongoing artificial suppression of the yuan, have created a more frugal middle class, which means Chinese companies need to keep exports up if they want to keep their businesses running. But what do you think? Will the housing crisis in China lead to the collapse of its broader economy? How will the US and other Western nations be affected? At this moment, can China even afford to go to war with Taiwan? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.